Every once in a while, the video game industry is hit by a seemingly perfect game company. One that values creativity, innovation, and is able to make games that are instant cult classics. There might be a few game companies that spring to mind when I say this, but there's one that stands out as a particularly important example to me: Treasure. Treasure is a game studio that's been active for nearly 20 years, and while the company definitely has a distinct style, Treasure isn't known for one series or genre in particular. The most consistent theme to Treasure is quality. Whether they're making a shoot 'em up with Nintendo, a dungeon crawler with Sega, or the best damn fast food game in the history of fast food video games. Treasure is the kind of company that will make you fall in love with their games. So much so that I played every single game they have ever developed, and I want to talk about it. There's a lot to cover here, so get comfortable because this is the full history of Treasure through the video games they made. Treasure was founded in 1992 in Tokyo by a group of former Konami employees who spun off from the company. Konami was, and still is, one of the biggest names in video games, and Treasure employees got their start working on games like Super Castlevania 4 and The Simpsons arcade game. As with any company that gets as big as Konami in the 90s, developers are going to get pretty disillusioned. The 1990s are remembered as a golden age for Konami in terms of creative ideas and great games, but for the developers who were actually doing their work, there was another side to it. Konami was reliant on established IPs, sequels, and licensed games to the point that many employees were tired of the same things over and over again. When you look at the quality products Konami were releasing, what you don't see are all the countless hours spent by developers on a project they might not have had much of a personal investment in. So, in 1992, roughly 10 employees of Konami went on to form their own studio to pursue the types of games they actually wanted to make. Thus, the independent studio Treasure was born. Treasure has a very different organizational structure to bigger studios at the time. Each of their games don't really have respectively developers. Their aim is to make projects they find interesting, not just what will sell well. You'll probably be familiar with many studios today with a similar philosophy, but in 1992 that was seriously bold and risky for the time and place Treasure found itself in the industry. Leading into 1993, Treasure grew and began working on a new game for the Sega Genesis that they wanted to pitch to Sega to get them to publish it. In North America, the Sega Genesis is known as a punk icon that took on Goliath Nintendo, but in Japan it wasn't quite as big, and Sega were more known for arcade games. That combined with the fact that no one on the Treasure team had experience with Sega made this a risky first venture. Their idea was for a run and gun similar to the likes of Contra, but Sega rejected it, for now. Sega saw potential in the idea, but Treasure was an untested company, so Sega commissioned them to make a licensed game based off of McDonald's for Sega Genesis. The first game Treasure developed after their bold breakaway from Konami was a McDonald's game. It didn't seem like the most glamorous job, but Treasure decided to make it anyways, and they worked on it at the same time as their other run-and-gun project. While the McDonald's game was finished first, Treasure sat on it a little so their run-and-gun project, Gunstar Heroes, could be released first. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you real quick before I talk about that game. This isn't my first rodeo with Treasure. I have a few other videos on this channel where I talk about their past history and games. This video is sort of a remake, where I bridge them all together, update the writing and quality, and talk about the company as a whole, as well as any games I might have missed. If you've seen those videos, please do keep watching. I have more to say on each of them, and my mic quality is actually passable this time. Thanks for bearing with me a bit there. If you do enjoy it, I'd appreciate if you could subscribe, as I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of 2025. Thank you. Gunstar Heroes is a run-and-gun game, and there's a lot of running and a lot of gunning. The experience starts out as a massive sugar rush of a game. Enemies are everywhere on screen, which makes for a chaotic experience. The things that set this game apart from the other examples of the genre are health, weapons, and some of the melee attacks on display. You can grapple enemies as well as attack while diving. That dive move is super fun. It's the unsung hero of the game because as soon as you master how and when to use it, you can start to manage the chaos. Most run and gun games are known for being brutally difficult and unforgiving. In most of them, it only takes a few hits to be killed, and your lives are extremely limited. Gunstar Heroes, on the other hand, gives you a full life bar and checkpoints in each stage, so there's plenty of room to make mistakes. You can restart as much as you need, which is very generous for this era. It is a hard game, but with short levels, you can play in any order and frequent checkpoints, it's not going to feel too brutal. The actual level design in each stage is good, but they're mostly on the short side because the bosses are the core of the game. I'll get to them in a bit. My main complaint with the gameplay is probably the lack of an ability to lock your character in place while shooting. When you're shooting, and when you want to move, you have to fully move your character, which can sometimes result in unnecessary damage. This is mostly a problem in boss fights though, to be fair. You have a few types of ammo in the game, which you're able to pick up on the fly. You can even swap between the different types of ammo. I enjoy the unpredictable feel it gives the game. Anytime you pick up weapons, it could completely change the way you handle shooting, and enemies will drop weapons which give you the chance to change your strategy on the fly. It reminds me of games like Halo, where you can change your weapons constantly based on what enemies drop. The bosses in Gunstar Heroes aren't just the bread and butter of the game. They are so influential to Treasure as a company, they will go on to be their bread and butter. Treasure is known for big, bombastic boss fights that make up a large part of games' structures. Oftentimes, their bosses will have multiple moving parts and just take up an entire screen. For a first game, Gunstar Heroes nearly perfects these boss fights, and taking on its mechanical marvels is exhilarating, while still making you slow down and consider your options deeply. The most iconic boss is definitely Seven Force, a giant mech that's able to transform between 7 different forms, who you fight on a minecart track. It's an endurance test, but when you finally manage to beat it, the sigh of relief you breathe is so satisfying. Another highlight is the silly dice maze. Do you remember King Dice from Cuphead? His boss fight was basically a giant Gunstar Heroes reference. The game puts you through a grueling gauntlet of different challenges, with a boss fight at the end, and your luck is determined by the roll of a dice. That level also has a fake-out ending, and I'm ashamed to say it, but I did die to it the first time I played it. The gameplay formula of Gunstar is simple, but you really do have to acknowledge just how perfect they got the boss fights in this game. Gunstar Heroes has a very rudimentary story. You're a child soldier against an evil empire, and everyone has funny color theming. The game's got a sci-fi setting, and the designs are cool, but they have a certain level of dorkiness to them. Treasure's art would go on to look pretty goofy, yet iconic. The art style is bright, and the colors pop, especially the bright guns and explosion effects. The robot designs are probably the most memorable parts of the game, especially the bosses. The visual style can sometimes be a bit much though. It hurts my eyes after extended play sessions given how explosive it is, and I feel as if the menu designs and UI could have been a little more readable. There's just this dark blue line on top of the screen, and it's not bad, but there could have been better ways of making this visual information clear to you. Gunstar Heroes ends with a scene where your brother Gunstar Green, who was in control of Seven Force, reveals that the Empire was using him, and to atone for his sins, he sacrifices himself to defeat the villain. From a modern perspective, I'm not gonna pretend that the ending is much more than cute, given how abrupt it is, but it does give the game a bittersweet feeling. It shows that it's about more than just shooting the bad guys. Gunstar Heroes was a success upon release, and time only serves to make its influence clearer. It's often considered one of the foundational titles of the Genesis library, and a whole generation of titles were inspired by it. I previously mentioned Cuphead, but another big influence Gunstar Heroes had was with Tom Fulp, who created the site Newgrounds and several games on that site. He has literally said that Gunstar Heroes was the game that made him want to make a video game. Without Gunstar Heroes, all the influence Newgrounds had wouldn't have happened. Everything from Among Us to Video Game Donkey might not have happened. Gunstar Heroes might just be Treasure's magnum opus. It's inspired a sense of creativity among so many people, and really cemented Treasure as a treasure to the gaming industry. Play the game if you haven't already, it's a lot of fun. It feels a little weird that I basically just suggested Treasure has already peaked, but look, they still have some incredible games yet to make. Gunstar Heroes was a cult success, which put them on the map, but unfortunately, they're gonna find out pretty quickly that the games they want to make aren't always the games that get them respect or money. But that doesn't mean they have to be lazy or push out mediocre products. Their next title was McDonald's Treasureland Adventure. Not only did they make a McDonald's game that's actually good, they put their own name in the title. Treasure is about to prove that even though you're forced to do the dirty work of a game industry, that doesn't mean you have to be lazy about it. The rumors are true and McDonald's Treasureland Adventure is actually good. You play through 3 long stages as Ronald McDonald with his iconic magic attack and scarf grappling hook. The game is very bright and cheery, and the set pieces actually manage to stand out pretty well. There's a train level, even a level set on the moon. How can you dislike those? It's short, but it at least manages to feel pretty fresh throughout, thanks to the ways in which it mixes up gameplay on the fly. There isn't much connection to McDonald's besides the characters, which makes you feel like you're not being advertised to. No McDonald's food items appear in the game, which is probably because of some legal stuff. You can't show someone eating food off the ground. The whole plot of the game is about Ronald searching for treasure, which doesn't exactly seem like something he would do, but I'm no expert on McDonald's lore. One thing to understand is that Ronald McDonald is really pathetic in this game. You start with just 2 lives, a pittance of health, and a magic attack that takes a few hits to take down even basic enemies. You can upgrade all those things though. Unlike the average McDonald's employee, Ronald has a lot of potential for growth, since you can upgrade your damage and health bar by a ton. You just need to find treasure throughout the level, and purchase upgrades at shops. This encourages you to look around, and it makes for a platforming experience that's more than just moving from right to left. I would liken it to a shoot-up like Gradius. You start off with a pea shooter, but get stronger as you go on, only for a death to restart all of it. This comparison is going to become relevant once Treasure starts to develop shoot-em-ups, like Gradius. This system comes with its own problems, since when you reset, it might be frustrating to grab everything again, and there's a bit of a learning curve to mastering it. On normal difficulty, McDonald's Treasureland Adventure can be a surprisingly difficult game, especially because it restarts you from the beginning if you run out of lives or continues. It's at least short though, so it works. McDonald's Treasureland Adventure is a game you have to learn the ins and outs of to succeed, but not in a way that feels overly frustrating. Now, the bosses are an area where I find the game lags behind a little. They're far from the giant elaborate encounters in Gunstar Heroes. Most of the bosses have gimmicks where you need to be damaged to actually deal damage to bosses, which is confusing to get used to, and I can imagine a lot of kids getting stuck on these. I've seen people argue McDonald's Treasureland Adventure is one of the best platformers on Sega Genesis, and one of Treasure's best outings. It's a good game, but I don't agree with that. It's worth playing if you're curious though, because the way it handles being a platformer is at least interesting. Several ideas from this game would be repurposed, or at least expanded on in Treasure's next game, directed by the same person, and named after what your girl gave me last night, Dynamite Headdy. After the release of McDonald's Treasureland Adventure, Treasure split itself up to work on the next 4 games, which were all published by Sega for the Genesis. Some of these games are considered spiritual successors to previous games, while others are in completely new genres nobody at Treasure was experienced with before. Here's Dynamite Headdy, released in 1994. Treasure is a company very fixated on making what they want to make, not just what will sell well. That is still true of Dynamite Headdy. It is an absolutely bizarre, quirky game that someone clearly cared deeply about. But it was also made with commercial success in mind, and the biggest example of this is the localization. There were tons of changes I'll get into later that make the American version vastly inferior. Dynamite Headdy is a great game, but if you're playing the American version, there's gonna be some giant flaws. Thank you, Sega of America, you ruined the game. You play as a puppet named Headdy, the backgrounds look bolted on, clouds are held up by wire, you fight bosses in a green room, and more. That signature bright, cheery style is back, and it makes sense because of the cartoon world. Like McDonald's Treasureland Adventure, you have a sort of grappling hook, but here it's much more intuitive. Headdy can detach his head to hook onto things and attack enemies. There's also a whole bunch of set pieces and different level designs, and they all fit within the theater theme, which genuinely makes it fun to see what the game will pull next. One particularly memorable set piece has a shifting floor that creates a pseudo 3D effect. It's not even that painful to play on. A lot of the ways this game creates set pieces reminds me of Super Castlevania 4 and other games on SNES that use Mode 7 graphics. The Sega Genesis didn't really have a Mode 7 equivalent, so it arguably makes it even more impressive to see that in this game. And yes, some former Treasure employees did work on Super Castlevania 4. This game also features power-ups. Most of the time I can take them or leave them, but they are pretty useful in some boss fights. Some of the power-ups allow you to platform differently, or take alternate routes, which is cool. Although sometimes the power-up will stop you for a mandatory basketball minigame, and that is not cool. Bosses are back to being a major part of the game's structure. They're a ton of fun. Each of them usually have pretty obvious targets, which a cherub thing conveniently tells you about. They are all mostly normally giant, filling up the whole screen. There's lots of these kinds of bosses. Clearly it was a priority for the development team, and figuring them out is pretty satisfying. But there is a problem. For a game so heavily reliant on bosses having a limited life system, it's not really the best approach. Yes, this game has a limited life system, and you will have to restart from the beginning of the game if you run out of lives. It's not too big a deal though, because you do get a lot of lives in the Japanese version. The American version of the game only gives you 2, and it completely removes the ability to get continues. It's awful. The stages are so long and full of enough bosses, it makes it brutally difficult to even get past the first level when you begin. This was entirely because of pressure from Sega of America, and it's terrible. I don't want to get hung up on the localization too much, but it does pretty much ruin the game. And on top of this, none of the story was translated. They didn't even bother giving it a story, which is really surprising to me. To be fair, it is a puppet show, so it's not like it's completely out of the ordinary for it to be silent. But still, what the hell? You took out the story for no reason. Whatever. Dynamite Headdy is still a good game, and I highly recommend it. Just play the Japanese version or use save states on the American version. This game, Gunstar Heroes, and almost all the games Treasure had developed for Sega Genesis are currently available on modern hardware through compilations if you're curious to give them a shot. Unfortunately, McDonald's has not re-released McDonald's Treasureland Adventure. What a travesty. The same day the Genesis version was released, Dynamite Headdy received a port for Sega GameGear. It was not handled by Treasure. Development was handled by a company called Minato Giken, and it's a weird version of the game. I did not think Dynamite Headdy would work on the GameGear at all. There's so much spectacle because bosses are so plentiful, and the whole game is themed around a stage play in a very distinct way. This game was even inspired by Monty Python. You can't get Monty Python on a GameGear. But it actually did come out pretty well in the conversion. GameGear games already have really bright color palettes, so the game looks pretty nice. I'd call it an inoffensive platformer. That said, it does a good job of actually adapting elements instead of keeping them the same. The first world is a good example of this. Multiple level elements from later on show up here, like Dynamite Headdy Mania, and the bosses changed in a pretty smart way. In the Genesis version, it's this big tin dog thing that jumps horizontally so that you can attack its tail. But here, it's more vertical, which works better with the screen size. The biggest problem in the port though is probably the audio design. The music doesn't sound great, and there's a weird whistle sound effect every time you attack or take damage. It gets pretty grating after a while, which is a shame when the original had such good sound design. It might feel weird to criticize it like this, but sound design is an important part of the game. It gives the player feedback, context, and it's just fun when the sound effects are more realistic, or fun. The American version of the game is also arbitrarily more difficult still, which is pretty dumb. Continues are taken away, it's just as bad. At least they didn't completely remove the story this time. Dynamite Headdy also received a Master System port exclusive to Brazil. The Master System was popular in Brazil, and versions of the console are still sold there to this day, so lots of games that got ported to GameGear also got ported to the Master System. This port is literally identical to the GameGear version, to the point that the game has a border because it was made for a small GameGear screen. That's pretty funny. I can't imagine it would be very fun to play a game like that on a TV. In 1995, Gunstar Heroes would also get a port to GameGear. It's a little odd that it happened after Dynamite Headdy. The port was handled by M2 and it's not very good. The highest compliment I can give to the GameGear version of Gunstar Heroes is that it technically works. Most of the original game is here, with one level stripped out, the silly dice maze. Gunstar Heroes' fun level design, movement, and exhilarating spectacle is mostly kept intact, but from playing it, it's abundantly clear this is not how the game was meant to be played. Gunstar Heroes was basically pushing the Genesis to its limits technologically, and on the GameGear, it makes for a game that's constantly slowing down and just barely chugging along. I don't think there's a single second of gameplay footage I captured where a sprite isn't flickering, and in the Genesis version, the constant stream of enemies and laser blasts is manageable, but for a smaller screen it's more overwhelming. It technically works, it's pretty hard to make sense of any of the spectacle though. The spectacle is a huge part of Treasure's games. I can't call it bad or anything, it's fun, it's just got flaws. You might be thinking I should give this game the benefit of the doubt because it's on a lower budget system, and yeah, that's true. That is something we should note, but when those are the conditions you're making a game in, you should adapt the game instead of just recreating it. Change up elements of platforming, level design, and mechanics to make it work better for the system it's on. That way, you can make Gunstar Heroes fans happy with a similar game, while prioritizing quality like Treasure would do, and making something in conversation with them. That is not done here, or at least it's not the primary design philosophy. This port doesn't abandon the idea of adapting a game at all, because there are also some necessary changes. For example, the mine level changes from a minecart on a track to a helicopter that you press a button to control the verticality of. That's worse though. That's worse! I like their idea, but it's a pain to control and doesn't work very well. This level is very short-lived, however, as you're almost immediately thrust into the boss fight with 7 Force. In this version, it is abundantly clear that 7 Force was meant to be fought on rails, and the way your character controls feels incompatible with a boss designed this way. In the Genesis version of Gunstar Heroes, reorienting yourself to attack and dodge is quick and snappy, but in the GameGear port, you'll be fighting controls more than the actual boss. I don't even get how this is less technologically intensive than the minecart. While looking at those ports was fun, they're a little bit irrelevant since they're pretty obscure and weren't actually developed by Treasure. I just find them an interesting footnote in their history. Treasure's next title was YuYu Hakusho Makyo Toitsusen, a fighting game based off the YuYu Hakusho anime series. It was released in 1994, and it was a Japan exclusive until it got a release in Brazil in 1999, on Sega Genesis. The Dreamcast was already out in 1999. Brazil is a bizarre world sometimes. Makyo Toitsusen was mostly based around the Dark Tournament arc of the YuYu Hakusho series, arguably the most important tournament arc in all of anime. There are 11 playable characters: Yusuke, Kuwabara, Kurama, Hiei, Elder Toguro, Younger Toguro, Genkai, Jin, Shu, Itsuki, and some weirdo called Shinobu Sensui. Look, I haven't watched the series past the Dark Tournament arc, I have no idea who he is. When I first played the game, it felt like an early example of a janky fighting game meant to capture Street Fighter II's success. It's very slow, the game isn't much of a challenge, and it doesn't seem to be more than a B-tier 90s fighting game. But once you look at it deeper and see the context of its development, it's an important game and you have to respect it. In 1994, a company called FamilySoft released Asuka 120% for FM Town PCs in Japan. That game was broadly seen as the first anime fighter, and it was a success. YuYu Hakusho Makyo Toitsusen repurposes a lot of its gameplay elements, bringing them to consoles. The game was even worked on by many of the people who made Asuka 120% in the first place. The combat in Makyo Toitsusen is slow, sure, but there's lots to appreciate about it if you can stick it out. I enjoy the deliberate nature of it. You have to think carefully about how you attack and approach each fight, and there's enough characters with their own moves that if you really stick to it, you can find a lot of depth. And people did stick to it. It was a very big success in Japan, and it, alongside Asuka 120%, inspired a lot of fighters with this more anime style in the future. The fact that Treasure made something so influential to the fighting game genre shows their versatility. Treasure isn't just one thing, nor do they make one type of game. They know how to constantly evolve in lots of different ways, and not all of their employees came from Konami. One thing this game features differently from other fighters at the time is the ability to step between the background and the foreground. Technically, Fatal Fury had this, but it's not quite the same. In Makyo Toitsusen, this mechanic mostly is just here because you can fight multiple opponents at once, or have team battles with multiple people. But you can also use it to dodge attacks. I can't call it especially novel when you're just playing the arcade mode against one opponent, but with friends it could have been really unique for the time. There weren't many multiplayer games on the Genesis in 1994. I could get someone to play it with me to test if that's true, but do I really seem like I want to do that now? From a modern perspective, it holds up, but doesn't quite reach the heights of Street Fighter or KOF. It's on the Fighter's History tier. That's actually a pretty fun game, that's not an insult at all. I might be getting a little distracted here. YuYu Hakusho Makyo Toitsusen is an excellent example of the kinds of successes that can come from sideways thinking, not just pushing console hardware forward. Treasure's next title was a sort of successor to Gunstar Heroes. It's also a run and gun and features several elements from the game. It is by no means a sequel though. There's barely even that much running, the game is mostly gunning. This is Alien Soldier, released in 1995. When you first start Alien Soldier, you will probably be met with confusion and frustration. There isn't really a sense of freedom in the movement, and your character moves in a more stilted way compared to Gunstar Heroes. Your sprite is large compared to the smaller stages as well, and you even have a time limit to contend with. After a little bit of a learning curve though, you'll find that there's lots to appreciate about Alien Soldier. You can float in place when you jump, as well as teleport to avoid certain attacks. Most of the weapons from Gunstar Heroes return, but the context in which you use them is different thanks to the more tight, intense nature of the game. You can't mix and match them the same way, so you'll end up switching between them depending on the stage and the bosses you fight. Alien Soldier is mostly dedicated to the bosses. The levels are very short and mostly for show. The levels before the bosses are more of a mercy if anything, because of the healing pickups peppered throughout. The game is basically one giant 25 boss rush, and each and every one of them has so much soul put into their fights. Figuring out which weapons work the best against each boss, and how to defeat them optimally is a ton of fun. Seven Force from Gunstar Heroes even returns. One thing to note about this game, however, is that I recommend playing it on easy difficulty for the first time playthrough. There are two difficulties, super hard and super easy, and super hard has a limited amount of lives, which isn't great for a boss rush. Don't worry, there's still plenty of challenge in super easy mode despite the name. I recommend a playthrough on this mode just to familiarize yourself with the bosses, and if you beat the game like that, try it again on hard mode. You earned it. I believe in you, champ. There's 25 bosses in total throughout the game, which might not seem like much, but it is a ton when the bosses are so big and bombastic. There were lots of scrap plans for the game. They even planned for it to have 100 bosses. I admire the sheer confidence in even trying to make a game like that in 1995. Getting to a quarter of the way there isn't bad. For most of the bosses, you'll frequently be teleporting around and making use of your ability to float in the air momentarily. Makes you feel like the underdog, but also like you're attacking a boss from all angles. There's also a slightly more advanced move, the Counter Force. Pressing B twice in rapid succession has you bring up an energy ball that can nullify projectiles and send you flying backwards if you're in the air. It's basically a parry, and another method of dealing with the big amount of projectiles on screen. The art style and design of the game is something special. Some of the boss designs are very elaborate, and border on Lovecraftian in their makeup. There's a pretty elaborate story in the game with some lore, but it's all told in an opening crawl that's pretty poorly translated, to the point that it's almost incomprehensible, and the plot never comes up again after that opening crawl. Alien Soldier wasn't ever technically released in North America. It was a download exclusive to the Sega Channel service, and it never received a physical copy. I wish it did, because it's a shame more people couldn't play it. Alien Soldier is the baby of basically one person, Hideyuki Suganami. During the time Treasure was split up, he was the sole programmer working on the game, before a few others joined in. It was a very cute baby, and in the end a very dangerous C-section had to be performed. That's actually how he worded it. My point is that Alien Soldier is an intense game, but also one that's concise and precise. It's pretty impressive that the singular vision of one programmer was able to be brought to fruition like this, even if it's a little bit of a compromise from their insanely high ambitions. Alien Soldier was the perfect spiritual successor. It represents the best way to build on the gameplay ideas of a past game without just doing a sequel. Even if Alien Soldier isn't as famous as Gunstar Heroes, I find myself going back to it just as much as that game, maybe even more. Treasure would release just one more game for Sega Genesis also in 1995, a dungeon crawler, sort of like A Link to the Past on Genesis, Light Crusader. By the time Light Crusader was released, the industry was moving past the Genesis. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn had already been released, and even though the industry hadn't fully switched over to 3D development, it was well on its way. Light Crusader pushes the hardware to its absolute limit, and the perspective creates a pseudo 3D effect. Light Crusader is set in one dungeon with multiple layers, and it has you playing as a knight, solving puzzles and defeating enemies. There's also a hub world, made up of a castle and a small village that you'll sometimes visit between dungeon layers, giving you a nice break from the action. This is one of two Treasure games I own a physical copy of, although I had to resort to buying a custom box instead of the original, which ended up being more expensive than the game itself. Don't worry, Wario World, though, I plan to own you someday. Light Crusader begins in a very cinematic way. There's a cutscene showing off some gorgeous sprite work, interspersed with opening credits like a movie. It really looks like a PC game. It reminds me of some of the opening scenes in the Ultima games. We're introduced to our hero Sir David, who's taking a well-deserved vacation after some questing, only to find trouble in the kingdom that yanks his ass out of retirement. Right off the bat, the perspective is the most eye-catching part of the game. It's not quite top-down, nor is it fully 3D. You see the game from a very particular angle that gives it a diorama-like feel. I would compare it to Super Mario RPG, with the difference being that it's a full-on action game instead of an RPG. Does it work the best? Not really. Sprite flickering is common, and even though you have a shadow underneath your character, platforming can be janky when depth perception isn't the clearest. But it also gives the game a sort of character to it, and the act of just moving around in Light Crusader is fun once you can get used to it. Even though it doesn't look like a Treasure game, you can feel some of the influence of their past titles. You have a dive attack, and even spells you can use in combat that can be mixed and matched like Gunstar Heroes. I'm glad those abilities are in the game too, because combat is a pretty big part of the game, with some rooms needing you to clear out a wave of enemies to progress. Their perspective makes it hard to properly gauge distances, so sometimes the dive attack and spells can make up for this. If you enter encounters just wildly swinging your sword, you probably won't have a good time. Light Crusader also gives you the ability to use any healing items you have on your person automatically. That might seem wasteful, but I recommend always keeping the feature on. Healing items are plentiful enough that you won't be wasting a scarce resource, and it's nice to not have to worry about constantly pausing and selecting items to heal. Of course, every layer of the dungeon features a boss as well, and there are some pretty imaginative ones that end up being a pretty memorable part of the game. The castle and village are a hub world, but they're fairly small, and exploring areas outside the dungeon isn't the focus of the game. You can think of them more as a space for downtime between the constant exploration and the action. There are some pretty charming NPCs though, and going through and talking to people is a nice distraction. You could just push any objects in the overworld around for no reason, and I love it. The button to interact with NPCs and the button to swing your sword are the same, Zelda CDI style, so you might find yourself accidentally attacking NPCs, but it's okay, because the game has the funniest workaround imaginable. It just flashes the word oops on screen if you attack someone by accident. They don't even care. Amazing. The dungeon is huge, but luckily you have a map of each floor, so you won't get too lost. There's some light puzzles that make the dungeon crawl even more varied. They aren't quite as complex as something like A Link to the Past, which makes use of multiple floors and items though. One thing that can get slightly annoying is that you might have to reset a room if you push a block to the corner of the room, and there isn't a button to reset it. You'll have to walk out of a room and re-enter surprisingly often. The game is at least generous, and then it tells you directly if some rooms require a puzzle to be solved to progress, or if you will have to fight all the enemies to progress. Admittedly, it tells you that with a crunchy voice sample, so you might have to consult the manual to actually understand what they're saying. The dungeons get more and more mystical the further you go, and there's a pretty creepy atmosphere throughout. This magical ambiance is the kind of thing that never stops sticking in your head. Treasure's string of games on Sega Genesis is iconic, and Light Crusader is a hell of a way to end it. The company has fully established itself as a cult classic machine, able to master multiple genres while keeping their charm throughout. It wasn't always perfect, but so far Treasure hasn't had any significant missteps. I wish more companies could be as quality as them. I guess maybe Dynamite Headdy, their localization counts as a misstep, but they haven't had any bad games. And even if not every company can make games as quality as Treasure, the games industry would be a lot richer if they could make games as interesting as them. It's 1996, and after working on these 4 games, Treasure is ready to work on games for the next generation of hardware. This is Guardian Heroes, published by Sega for Sega Saturn. I'm gonna review the Xbox Live Arcade version because Saturn emulation is hard. Guardian Heroes is a chaotic beat-em-up. It's a genre some Treasure employees have experience with, but that was back when they were at Konami, and those beat-em-ups are very different from Guardian Heroes. there's no Mr. Burns boss fight in Guardian Heroes. It is a very silly game though, and for a beat 'em up, it has a lot more content than you'd expect. You can play as 5 protagonists in the story mode solo, or with a second player, and the game has a bunch of branching story paths depending on the choices you make. If you massacre innocent civilians for no reason, you're getting a bad ending, you monster. There can be as many as 30 stages in the game, and no 2 playthroughs of Guardian Heroes will fully be the same. I always admire the confidence when a game lets you miss out on content in a first playthrough, but gives you an easy opportunity to play it again for a more varied experience. Guardian Heroes is the absolute culmination of that mindset, and even though a traditional beat 'em up like Charles in Time or Streets of Rage might be longer in one playthrough, Guardian Heroes definitely has more replay value, and content. The fighting is nothing short of bombastic. If Final Fight is the Street Fighter of beat 'em ups, this is the Marvel vs. Capcom. Well, until Marvel Cosmic Invasion comes out. Racking up damage and doing huge combos is at the core of this game. If you're not playing in multiplayer, the game gives you a CPO-controlled ally, and you'll need it because the game has so many enemies all over the place. The game is completely in 2D, and there's 3 layers of gameplay you jump between to fight: a foreground, middle ground, and background. It allows fighting game-like command inputs to be possible, and it definitely makes it more distinct from beat 'em ups that allow full movement. So this much variation does a lot to set Guardian Heroes apart, especially when beat 'em ups have kind of fallen out of style by this point in the industry. At least ones like Streets of Rage. One of the designers of this game also worked on Yu Yu Hakusho Makyo Toitsusen, so the idea of jumping between the background and foreground likely came from there. The enemy variety is a little lacking though, unfortunately. Most of the enemies are generic knights, with the occasional ninja or troll or giant robot boss. I can't fault such a small development team that there aren't very many enemies, when they did so much to give this game more content, but some of the allure of the branching story paths is lost when the enemies feel this same. I really love the art style and characters of Guardian Heroes. They look distinct, and that signature treasure dorkiness makes for character designs that look silly but fun. Look at Han's Popeye arms, or whatever is going on with Serena's eyes. I can confirm that the guy with the big sword is the best to play as out of the bunch. The game is set in a medieval fantasy setting, but some more futuristic elements creep up a bit, like giant robots. This might be the treasure game with the most story so far. There's lots of recurring characters and dialogue that fleshes out the fantasy world. Characters have backstories, and their backstories play into the story in a way that couldn't really be done in the genre before. Whoa, that bad guy is a member of the Blue Knights. I used to be a member of the Blue Knights. Now I can go storm the castle. The story is schlocky. It's a little poorly translated with some pretty cheesy jokes, but that just makes it more memorable. There are some funny lines in the game for sure. There are a couple of other modes besides the main story mode. There's being the arcade and versus modes. Versus is what you'd expect. You can fight another person as any of the characters in the game, and arcade mode is really more of a survival mode. You go into a coliseum and fight a comically large crowd of enemies. You will probably get hit by all their attacks simultaneously in the first few seconds and instantly die, so try not to let that happen. Leveling up is automatic, with no need to select what attributes to level up, so you can just get better and better as you go on, but enemies do keep spawning. Here's the kicker though, look at this roster. You can play as every character featured anywhere in this game, with a total roster count of 45. Will the moveset of Citizen 4 be as fleshed out as a protagonist? No, but it's still super impressive. I do wish there was a free play mode in the story where you could try these characters out. Sometimes you just want to beat up some bad guys without the story baggage, and the roster is so impressive, it's almost wasted on only being in these modes. Guardian Heroes might just be the second best treasure game with G-Blank Heroes as its title, but it's still great and stands out as one of the best games of the Sega Saturn library. That might not sound like much, but the Saturn had Virtua Fighter, House of the Dead, Symphony of the Night, and you know, it had more games than the Sega Genesis, so yes, it's a big deal. It's a goofy game you can't help but love, despite its flaws. As with every other game so far, the effort and passion is visible from a mile away. One thing that might stand out is that Guardian Heroes is played completely in 2D. In 1996, the prevailing narrative was that 3D games were the future of gaming, and most of the big titles made by the major manufacturers were in 3D. Treasure was much more hesitant to make 3D games compared to their contemporaries. They were very much of the opinion that 3D wasn't necessarily the path forward, and that it can exist alongside 2D games. That seems obvious almost 30 years later, but in 1996, that was bold. Admittedly, it's not that surprising that a beat-em-up on Sega Saturn would be in 2D, but their next game is a little more surprising. It's the first Treasure game created for a Nintendo console, and it's a 2D platformer. You can practically count the amount of 2D platformers on the Nintendo 64 with one hand. This is Mischief Makers, released in 1997. Mischief Makers is a big cult classic. A lot of Nintendo fans have a fondness for it in particular. The main character is even in Super Smash Bros. Remix. You love to see it. The game was published by Nintendo themselves in North America and Europe, but Enix was the publisher in Japan. Enix famously stopped putting out Dragon Quest games on Nintendo after the PlayStation came out, so Mischief Makers sort of represents two Nintendo development partner alumni returning for this new 64-bit system. They wouldn't partner with them in the same way they did with Sega, but later on, Treasure's going to work a little more closely with Nintendo on some of their projects. That's in 3 years though. For now, let's talk about Mischief Makers. The game stars a robot girl named Marina Lightyears on the Clancer planet, rescuing the professor who created her from an evil empire, as well as another mysterious threat in the background. Why did the professor make a robot with the waist the size of a wrist and thighs bigger than her head? I don't know, ask him. The game centers around Marina's ability to grab onto objects and throw things, which is used for platforming challenges, as well as some light puzzle solving. There's 5 worlds with roughly 12 stages each, and the focus of each world sort of shifts, with World 1 being more puzzle focused, World 2 being more platforming focused, World 3 going back to puzzles, and so on. I personally preferred the more platform focused levels, and World 2 was where the game really started to click with me, but the other worlds are still good. The game's got a bit of a slow burn because there's so many ideas in the gameplay and movement that you have to be slowly introduced to. It feels like that first world is a tutorial. Most of the platforming involves you grabbing these Clancer balls that float in the air, and launching yourself off of them or jumping between them. You even have a rocket boost that can slightly augment how you jump. The platforming stages take a while to become really fun, because of the need to get used to Mischief Maker's more unorthodox controls. But once you do get the hang of them, they are short, they are snappy, and have the best elements of Treasure's previous platformers baked into their DNA. The puzzle elements might seem like they distract from the platforming, but the two design philosophies can coexist, and it's a game that's fun in multiple ways. Technically the game has limited continues, but it's easy enough that you're not likely to get any game overs. Even if you do die a lot, you can easily get continues by spending red gems that are found throughout the game. In some parts, you might have to choose between blue gems that increase your life bar, or red gems that let you continue, which is a neat amount of agency, even if you'll probably have lots of both anyways. I also didn't mention the best part of this game. Shake, shake! You can shake Clancer balls to reveal hidden areas, or shake enemies and objects for gems. If you hear the adorable way Marina says shake, don't immediately love the game because of it, I don't know what to say to you. Each world has a mid-boss and a final boss at the end. The mid-bosses are alright, they just feel like souped up regular enemies, but the major bosses are a lot of fun. They keep what Dynamite Headdy and Alien Soldier did by showing you a boss's weak point, but you engage with them a lot differently when your method of attack is to catch and shake. The game is completely in 2D, but the visuals sometimes incorporate 3D effects. There's a very distinct visual style and an almost haunting atmosphere throughout certain parts of the game. The caves in World 2 are an especially memorable part, and most Clancers have the same ghostly face, which comes off as a little creepy but in a good way. There's a very distinct style to the game, I suppose, and I love some of the enemy designs. You can talk to lots of Clancers on your journey to get hints, which makes it feel like you have some connection to the characters. You can also grab everyone and throw them around if you choose. The real Mischief Maker was you the whole time. The risky circumstances of Mischief Maker's release adds a lot to its mystique. The fact that it was a fully 2D game, and that it was released in the early years of the N64, make it a real curiosity. That combined with the experience of the game, really make for a perfect hidden gem. Even though it was praised at the time of its release, Mischief Makers sort of got swept away in the tide of more graphically impressive 3D games on the system. Now, whenever people talk about Mischief Makers, all they can ever say is how underrated it is. And it is a very underrated game. What it does for the 2D platformer genre at a time when it seemed to be in decline was really impressive. Please put it on the Switch already. The next Treasure game was also released in 1997. Treasure is very good at pumping out great games quickly. They divide work up between multiple programmers, which is probably how they did it, but still, there's like 20 employees at the company. It's very impressive. The game is a run and gun technically, but in a very different style to Treasure's past. Silhouette Mirage. It originally released on Sega Saturn, but it got ported to PlayStation a year later, and that's the version I'll be reviewing. Partly because it has some original content, it's the only version of the game available in English, and Saturn emulation is hard. Silhouette Mirage has its fans. I am not one of them. The central gimmick is that enemies have either silhouette or mirage attributes to them, meaning they're either red or blue, and you have to hit them with either silhouette or mirage type blasts. The way you switch what attribute of weapon you're using is by facing left or right, so you'll have to think a little more strategically about how you fire by repositioning yourself at all points of the game. You can also grab enemies and throw them to the other end of the screen, or use the reflect move to take them out with their own bullets. You can run all over walls, and you even have a triple jump, which gives you lots of freedom of movement. The Silhouette Mirage gimmick is reflected all over the game's visuals. The protagonist, Shina, has a cool design with contrasting colors, and all the enemies have color palettes that make it clear what type of shot to use on them. There's a theme of sci-fi mixed with traditional magic to the game's visuals, which is a theme that I enjoy a lot. The game is slow-paced to accommodate the ways you approach combat, and while having to reorient yourself constantly leads to some annoying situations, the grappling and the reflector make up for it, since you can literally just throw enemies in the other direction and take them out that way. It's a decent enough start to the game, but it does get repetitive. There aren't very many different types of enemies for these run and gun sections, and I didn't really find that the game did much interesting with the Silhouette Mirage system beyond a surface level. Once you're done with level 2 or so, you'll feel like you've seen all the enemy encounters that the game has to offer, and there are 7 levels. Of course, bosses are a big part of the gameplay here, and levels are mostly in between sections for them. I can excuse the levels for not being that interesting because of this, but at the same time they could have been so much better. The bosses are where the game starts to shine. They have some pretty bizarre designs, and even though the Silhouette Mirage gimmick isn't used to its full extent, it comes up a bit in these fights. There might be a boss that has multiple parts which are red or blue, or one that switches forms, small stuff like that. They're not groundbreaking, but seeing a big fish with a cat girl head and shooting it a bunch is fun. Some of these bosses can very easily be trivialized though. You can purchase additional types of weapons at shops, and some of them are able to defeat bosses in literal seconds. There are a lot of bosses, some are harder than others, and the game has limited continues, so I imagine some of them are meant to be easy, but still it's weird when they feel like throwaway additions, and it does pad out the game. Coverage on a game like this wouldn't be complete without mentioning the company that published and localized it for an American audience, Working Designs. Working Designs translated a lot of niche Japanese games for US markets in the 90s, like Lunar, Arc the Lad, Popful Mail, and a couple of treasure games. For retro game fans, they're practically treated like Satan's Hellspawn for the alterations they usually make to games. Working Designs tends to add cheesy pop culture references and lighten up the tones of the games they touch to make them more palatable. On top of that, they often make games arbitrarily harder by making enemies deal more damage or making items in shops more expensive. There's some nuance to this situation. Working Designs aren't some malevolent force corrupting RJRPGs, because many of the games they touch wouldn't have had a chance to release in the US otherwise. Oftentimes in localization, you do need to change plenty of details, but yeah, the way they did localize many games was quite flawed. Mucking with the difficulty has adverse effects on the balancing of games they localize. Working Designs was a valuable part of the industry that is definitely of its time. They made Silhouette Mirage an even messier game. Items are much more expensive, and bosses take way longer to kill. That might seem like a good decision, but keep in mind that continues are still limited, so the balancing is way off. Apparently the game is meant to be played in one sitting, but it's 3.5 hours long, so that doesn't seem like the best decision. I don't know how much of the dialogue was changed in translation, so I can't really comment on that, but it does absolutely scream 90s localization. Shina is a weird character. She speaks in formal language and doesn't use contractions. She'll say it is instead of it's every time. But she's also snarky and has weird, elaborate quips. It's hard to explain, it's just kind of funny to me. Silhouette Mirage is a messy game. It's not a bad game by any means, but it has several design flaws that keep it from living up to Treasure's past. And then, a messy company proceeded to make a messy localization and made for an even more messy game. I am glad that Silhouette Mirage is a cult classic in some circles. It would be a good idea if some of the design elements could be expanded on in the future. What's that? That's exactly what would happen? Great, I'm looking forward to it. Let's talk about a really good game now. The next title is Radiant Silvergun. I don't know how they did it, but that is an even cooler title than Silhouette Mirage. Radiant Silvergun is a vertical shoot-'em-up released for Japanese arcades in 1998. Treasure technically had some experience with arcade games and shoot-'em-ups through Konami, but still, an indie studio making a game for arcades is a big deal. There was also a Sega Saturn port. There were ports to modern hardware too that combined both the console and arcade versions of the game. Radiant Silvergun is a bullet hell through and through. You have 6 of the longest and most pain-inducing stages I have ever experienced. Bosses are relentless, and the stage design is tight and demands a lot of precision. Even getting through the door of this game is extremely difficult. If you were playing in an arcade, you'd probably need enough quarters to cause inflation in a small country just to get past the first stage. But the parts I actually like about the game are all additions to the console version. And that is your upgrade system. The most genius part of the game by far, and the method by which you might stand a chance. Every enemy in the game is one of 3 colors, red, blue, and yellow. By shooting 3 enemies of one type, you get a chain bonus, which upgrades one of the several abilities you have in the game. This serves 2 purposes. The first is to make the game a sort of puzzle, and add depth to the gameplay. If you want to get better, you can't just shoot randomly. You have to focus on getting chain after chain to improve your game. The second is that your upgrades save between playthroughs. You can get super strong in one game, and that will save if you play it again. So theoretically, the more you play, the easier the game gets, and if you're able to stick it through, it's a very rewarding game. You'll still need to pay attention, and the game is hard of course, but after just a little while of playing, earlier areas or bosses that gave you trouble when you first played can be nothing. Of course, this rewards patience too, and it's very satisfying. The game makes you want to play it over and over again, but I would say it eventually does get a little stale to do the same stages so many times, knowing you're probably not going to get far. You're almost just grinding at a certain point. That might make it a game that's not very fun to play consistently, but it is fun to go back on every once in a while. Every month or so I'll go back to this game and try to beat it about 3 or 4 times. It's actually pretty similar to how you'd play an arcade game, just in your home instead of going out to an arcade each time. Normally, shoot-em-ups give you special weapons and power-ups that are removed upon each death. That gives you a sense of power and escalation, but it can be pretty frustrating at times to have to reset in an underpowered state each time. You know who else agrees with that? Treasure. Radiant Silvergun has about 6 different weapons that cover a wide range of abilities. Standard shots, shots that spread out behind you, homing shots, even a sword. You'll practically master all these weapons, and having access to them all at once is so seamless that it gives the game its own feel. In the same interview, developer Hiroshi Ayuchi explained that they deliberately slowed down some of the bullets to allow for more weaving between shots, since that's what they found the most fun about shoot-em-ups. I'm a believer that brutally crushing games are better when they give the player a mechanic that feels surprisingly generous. Think of something like the Estus flasks in Dark Souls, or the parry system in Sekiro. Radiant Silvergun is a master at giving the player a brutal challenge with surprising bits of mercy. There are some cutscenes and a story to the game which are so incomprehensible I didn't even try to understand. Something about a rock-like object. Each of the stages aren't played in chronological order if you're paying attention to the story, and so they're not even numbered in order. Stage 3 first, then stage 2 or 4, and then 5 or 6, and the finale is stage 1. That's so stupid you can't help but love it. The game uses 3D visuals in the background, and there's a very elaborate style to its enemy and boss designs. The actual characters are as goofy as ever though. They kind of remind me of the character designs in Gunstar Heroes. Treasure is going to have a pretty long and eventful history with shoot-em-ups in the future, and Radiant Silvergun was their first try to make one of those types of games. They passed with flying colors, and made a game that's genuinely a great introduction to the genre for anyone who's not super into shoot-em-ups. Radiant Silvergun directly addresses criticisms and annoyances of the genre and it made me interested in a genre I didn't really care about much before. The crazy part is that it's not even their most critically acclaimed shoot-em-up, but before that, their next title is the 3D arena fighter Rakugaki Showtime for PlayStation in 1999. Technically, this is the first game I'm covering that's a Japan exclusive, which is a little wild once you consider how niche some of their games are. Rakugaki Showtime is a very obscure game for one particular reason. Rakugaki Showtime is a 3D arena fighting game with a very distinct sketchy art style. Every character is drawn with crayon, which right off the bat gives the game a super memorable style. You can technically defeat your enemies by using melee attacks, or by throwing them, but really you'll want to use the various items across the stage, and just throw everything you can find at enemies. I really enjoy the mad dash gameplay. It lets you jump directly to items and enemies, and it works very seamlessly, allowing you to effortlessly move around the stage. Every stage has at least one dodgeball item that's always on screen, and it will probably be your main method of attack throughout the game, since it's pretty powerful. Once you throw it a few times though, it will turn super powered, and can unleash a super move if anyone throws it. You have to be very careful about throwing this dodgeball, because your opponent very well might be able to pick it up and use a super move against you if you throw the ball at them at the wrong time. A lot of the items can blow up in your face if you're not careful. The gameplay of Rakugaki Showtime is constantly frantic. It's a lot of fun to zip around the screen to throw rocket ships at people, but it's also a risky game with some strategy to it, and if you're button mashing, you probably won't get very far. It's definitely not the deepest game in the world. It has a Mario Kart-like amount of randomness, and it might get a little repetitive, but there's still a lot of fun to be had. The game supports a versus mode, where up to 4 players can fight at a time. Knowing that, I was a little surprised the game hadn't been released on Nintendo 64. That console supports 4 players without the need for a multi-tap, and the game was published by Enix, who also published Mischief Makers. In fact, Marina is a playable guest character in this game. I can't comment on the amount of content available in the game, since it's only in Japanese, but you know, when you boot up the game and press O button to get through the menus, you will be in the arcade mode, so that's most of what I played. I felt the arcade mode was slightly too long for my tastes, compared to other fighters, especially because it's a little repetitive, but it's still a great way of experiencing the game. Actually playing the game in versus mode with your friends absolutely feels like it's how the game was meant to be played, and I'm sure it could give you a great time. The visual style is the most interesting part about the game at first. I love the crayon art style the characters are animated in, and there's so much charm in the game. I love the designs of these pirate guys, and seeing Marina in the art style is neat too. There's a pretty large amount of characters in the game, and some of them are very wacky. Shout out to the psychic dog and the character that looks like if Cloud Strife was a lemming. Most of these backgrounds are modeled in 3D and aren't as detailed compared to the drawn sprites. Some of the stages come across as a little boring because of this, but there was probably a gameplay reason for it, and they have a distinct theming from each other at least, and affects the gameplay in clever ways as well. Shout out to this stage that might just be the least convincing dance party I've ever seen in a video game. Rakugaki Showtime remains one of the most obscure treasure games out there. It is a simple yet fun title and worth seeing for the art style alone. I legitimately think it could have captured some of the cult audience Mischief Makers had got if it had been released on N64 instead of the PlayStation, which had much more fighting games for it to compete against. The N64 did have their own sketchy fighting game with Rakuga Kids, I guess. A big reason Rakugaki Showtime is forgotten is that it was pulled from shelves shortly after its release, and we do not know why. The consensus seems to be that some kind of legal dispute between the rights to the game was what got it pulled, but there's not really many sourced claims for that online. Wikipedia just links to an unsourced IGN article, and all the coverage is very vague. It seems like a rabbit hole that someone who is smarter than me and has access to Japanese sources could go down someday. Maybe it was a copyright dispute over Rakuga Kids. Not trying to suggest anything, but that game was made by Konami after all. It's a shame this pretty decent game doesn't have more attention, but in a weird sort of way, it won't be the last we see of Rakugaki Showtime. The supposed legal trouble around the game really makes me wonder what it was like for Treasure to work with so many big publishers that might have completely different ways of handling publishing. Treasure wants to make good games first and foremost. Theoretically, the publishers they work with are tangentially related to that goal, but that might not always be what happens. The next game also released in 1999, Bangai-O. The game originally released on N64 as a Japan exclusive, but it got a Dreamcast port a year later, which I will be reviewing. This is probably the only game that was made for N64, got ported to Dreamcast, and only the Dreamcast version was available in the US. The localization was done by a studio called Conspiracy Entertainment. They also localized a Record of Lodoss War game, which is a very niche Japanese series. That made me think they're like a lesser known working designs, but no, they also published Ninja Bread Man. That information is not relevant to Bangai-O, I just had to mention it. Bangai-O is a game where you fly around in a mech and shoot everything in sight, trying to find the exits in one of 44 levels. It's a simple pitch that makes for some really solid gameplay. The game is basically a bullet hell. You're a small mech against a whole army, and you have to fight your way through, but there's also the need to think intelligently about how you move through each level. Meaning traversal and action are the two core tenets the game is built on. You have two characters who you can switch between on the fly, one of which has a laser attack that bounces off obstacles, and the other has a homing attack. The homing attack is best used in combat, and the laser is best used for traversal, I find. Oftentimes there are bombs you need to hit to destroy walls and move forward, and the more precise small lasers are better, and aren't likely to get you hit by the bomb's explosion the way a homing missile might. You really have to think about which character is best for the moment you're playing, and that adds a lot of strategy. Bangai-O feels like a hybrid shoot 'em up and puzzle game. What really makes the shooting fun is the missile barrage ability. You can hold down a button to release a burst of missiles around you. If you're being hit by bullets while you do this, you can turn them back around and basically convert enemy bullets into your own bullets. It is insane, it is fun, and you can shoot up to 400 bullets at the same time. You have a limited amount of uses for this counterattack, but it recharges from enemy pickups, so while you should be careful not to use it exclusively, it is a very powerful ability. You might be thinking that having 400 missiles on screen at the same time on a Dreamcast hardware would mess up the frame rate. Bangai-O responds by saying, "Can you say that in English, nerd? Cause we're here for a fun time, not a stable time." The frame rate is going to drop significantly once you clear out an entire room with 400 missiles, but it's not detrimental to your gameplay, so just enjoy the spectacle. You can improve your score by collecting fruit or destroying more of the stages, and the game gives you the option to view the layout of each level to find a more optimal path forward. If you do care about getting high scores, the game gives you a lot of chances to play that way. It did release in the 21st century, so do that many people still care? The tutorial system is very well done. Certain levels have optional conversations with a weird lady who tells you information about how to progress, and there are some funny interactions that lighten up the game a little. Bangai-O is very goofy, and there's quite a few moments where it breaks the fourth wall. The localization is a massive issue though. When a game is poorly translated, it can be charming, but the text in Bangai-O is full of lots of grammatical errors and spelling mistakes that make it borderline incomprehensible at times, and I think it comes off as a detriment. Bangai-O's self-aware, fourth wall breaking tone and grammatically nonsensical dialogue don't mix well, leading to a jokey game where you can't tell when it's joking. When you pause the game, you'll be met with a message, "Do you really want to quit?" They somehow misspelled the pause screen. And no, the answer is probably that I don't want to quit because I pressed the pause button, not the quit button, you fucking dunce. Some of the stages can get pretty long. Without knowledge of the layout, they could easily take 3 or 4 attempts. I don't have a problem with this at all, but keep in mind that you will die quickly and deal damage very, very quickly. And I wonder if the game would have benefited from more smaller, bite-sized levels because of it. A great example of this is the bosses. They're nothing too special, mostly just enemies with a bigger health bar. If you're directly hit by your missiles, you can lose your entire health bar in seconds, but they can also lose their entire health bar in seconds if you hit their missiles back at them. That makes for a fun duality, where gameplay can switch up on the fly, requiring you to take risks in some levels, while playing it safe in others. It would make that design philosophy just a little bit better if restarting was quicker, and levels were more compact. And speaking of restarting, what the actual fuck is this continue screen? Why is a ghost hiding in the bushes and taking a photo of a little boy? I don't even want to know what the unlocalized Japanese version of this okay, whoa. I kinda expect the nudity, I did not expect a clan member. Treasure is probably most well known for the games on Genesis like Gunstar Heroes, made in collaboration with Sega. But as we've seen, this company was capable of incredible versatility during the 3D era, and their legacy of innovation and quality doesn't just end. They're more than just the Gunstar Heroes company. Bangai-O in every game on the N64, PS1, and Saturn era shows us that they have a great eye for what makes games great. With the company still burning bright, they would release one more game for Nintendo 64 before the next console generation, Sin and Punishment. It's a Japan exclusive, but it's voice acted in English and was one of the first games to be added to the Wii Virtual Console and Nintendo 64 Online on Switch, so I consider it an honorary American-released N64 game. The standout aspect of the game is the fact that it was developed in direct collaboration with Nintendo R&D 1, the core Nintendo studio that built the Nintendo we all know today. Treasure pitched the idea of a shoot-'em-up where players would hold the N64 controller from the left side instead of the right side, and Nintendo worked with them to make the game. Nintendo actually has a pretty tight relationship with some smaller companies that have similar origins to Treasure and relies on them for AA games. Some examples are Alpha Dream, which was originally founded by ex-Squaresoft employees, Skip Limited, which was originally founded by ex-Squaresoft employees, and Monolith Soft, that was originally founded by ex-Squaresoft employees. I don't think Squaresoft treated their employees very well in the 90s. Nintendo is well known for usually envisioning a game by its gameplay and concept first, rather than IP. That's not too dissimilar from Treasure's way of forming game ideas, and a working relationship like this makes sense. There were still lots of complications in Sin and Punishment's development, however. It took 3 years to make, which was a lot for the time, especially once you consider how short the N64's lifespan was. Sin and Punishment involved more of Treasure's staff than any game they had previously created. Some Nintendo executives found Treasure difficult to work with because of their more lax free structure. The director Hiroshi Yamagami, who was with Nintendo, had trouble establishing deadlines and even called Treasure a weird company, which is genuinely a really funny thing for a director at Nintendo to say about a company they work with multiple times. In the end, the game was released at the tail end of the Nintendo 64 generation, and it was a perfect swan song to both it and this era of Treasure as a company. Sin and Punishment is another shooty bang bang game, but this time it takes an on-rails format. You have some basic left and right movement, and shoot the screen above and around you, not unlike a gallery shooter. I should address the controls up front because they are very localized to the N64's control pad. You use the D-pad to move, the circle pad to control your reticle as you aim, the trigger to shoot, and the L button to jump in the rare situations you need to jump. If an enemy gets close by, you can also spam a melee attack, which is mapped to the same button as fire. That melee attack is a fun get-off-me tool, and you can even use it to hit some projectiles back at the enemies who fire them towards you. There are also some areas where you can fire at environmental objects, or you have to prioritize multiple targets to progress. Now, if you were keeping track of that control scheme, it means that on modern hardware, you'll hold a controller something like this. It is an adjustment, you'll need a sec to get used to it. The N64 controller was a freaky little bastard that you don't hold like a regular game controller. That means that when a game on N64 has an even weirder control scheme and then gets emulated, it won't work seamlessly. I can't comment on how the original N64's control scheme worked, but on modern hardware, it's not too difficult to get used to once you get past that initial hurdle. It's just one of many things that makes Sin and Punishment feel like it crawled out of a portal from an alternate universe. The shooting gameplay is pretty fun, but I'd say the best part about the game are the ways in which it breaks that formula. Levels where bend and curve, the enemies can come from all different directions. Sometimes the levels just straight up turn into a side-scroller. There is so much spectacle, and even if it's a simple, short game, it's not as straightforward as you may expect. The gameplay is constantly fresh, it frequently reinvents itself, and it does a lot for the on-rails shooter genre. There weren't really many games like Sin and Punishment on console. Unexpectedly, bosses make up a big part of the game's structure, and they're a lot of fun to figure out how to beat. Some of them get absolutely insane. There's a boss fight that's a sword duel in an aircraft carrier. The final boss is a boss fight against a replica of the Earth, where you have to make sure it doesn't destroy the real Earth. There's also a third example I can't think of, because nothing will top how insane my second example was. You're in a mech, by the way. The first stage culminates in all of Tokyo being engulfed in a tsunami of blood. Might I remind you, this is a second-party Nintendo game. Sin and Punishment is a couple of hours long and features 3 stages that change the scenery a ton, from cityscapes to military bases to fields. I think a couple of hours is probably the perfect length for this type of game. It's fun to sit down and complete it in one go. Technically, Sin and Punishment has limited continues, but it's very forgiving. Health pickups are quite plentiful, and I was surprised to see that I had amassed 12 continues by the first time I died. The next time I died, on the very next stage, I had 15, so yes, it's a very forgiving game. Sin and Punishment looks great for an N64 game. It really pushes what the console was capable of, while staying true to its own distinct look. You can tell this game took a lot of time to make, even if it's just a couple of hours long. The enemy designs are creepy but memorable. The human designs are also quite creepy. You look just as much like bug people as the actual bugs, and I kinda like it. It gives the game an uncanny atmosphere, which complements the batshit insane story. The dialogue is understandable, but the voice acting isn't very good. Everyone seems to talk like a child, and I don't know why. The game wasn't meant for people who speak English though, and it wasn't localized, so I can't really judge them for that. It makes the game funny. Shout out to the scene where the female protagonist is transported to the far-off, apocalyptic future of 2017, and she meets the child she's eventually gonna have, and just does not give a fuck.
Heard of ruffians invading America.
Mommy, are the monsters gone?
Could you not call me Mommy?
That scene takes place in New York, and the only thing that survives in the skyline are the Twin Towers. I love this game. The story centers around a group of resistance fighters who are up against a group of invading aliens called ruffians, and the entirety of the evil, corrupt military-industrial complex. Yes, there's time travel. I need to stress again how crazy it is that Nintendo partly made this. This game's story is what would happen if Roland Emmerich directed Akira. I may have gotten a little carried away describing the oddities of this game, but look, Sin and Punishment is another highlight of Treasure's gamography and the N64 library. It is a decently well-known game, even if it's quite niche. The connection to Nintendo probably elevates its player base in the modern day. Saki, the game's protagonist, was in Smash as an assist trophy. He should be a playable character, but I digress. Sin and Punishment is one of Treasure's more popular titles, and it is still a massively underrated game. That's how you know we're dealing with a great developer. So with that, we're now in uncharted territory for me. Treasure's next game was Silpheed: The Lost Planet, released in 2000, which is the first of these games I've never reviewed on this channel before. I basically entirely rewrote most of my old videos as scripts for this compilation though, so you probably won't be able to tell that big a difference when I review it, hopefully. Silpheed is a shoot-'em-up developed by a company named Game Arts in 1986 for PC 8801 systems. There was also a Sega CD remake/sequel in 1993, also called Silpheed. Game Arts is a pretty long-running successful company, even if their name isn't too recognizable. The fact that the name is so generic doesn't help with recognizability. You might know them as the developer of Lunar. You might know Lunar as the game series I mentioned earlier in this video as an example of the types of games working designs localized. Both versions of Silpheed were mildly successful, but they're more remembered for the technical showcases they were for their respective consoles and eras, pushing the genre forward with pre-rendered graphics. In 2000, they made a sequel for PlayStation 2, and since Treasure had quite the reputation for shoot-'em-ups, they were recruited to help with development. So, the two small Japanese companies, Game Arts and Treasure, collaborated to make Silpheed: The Lost Planet. The game is a vertical shoot-'em-up, not unlike Radiant Silvergun, but there are quite a few differences in how it plays. The biggest being your weapons. There's a selection of different types of shots, and each time you try a stage, you have the option to add a weapon on both sides of your ship. It doesn't give you as much freedom as Radiant Silvergun, but it's a solid gimmick. Every time you retry a stage, you can change your build and experiment a little, and as you go on you unlock more weapons. I enjoy doubling up with 2 napalm bombs on each side of the ship. It doesn't have very much range, but they're very powerful when it comes to bosses. The Thunder Arrow is pretty fun to use too. If you're the type of person who likes to find ways to break games within their own rules, you'll have fun here. The stages let you refuel and change your weapons mid-stage too, which is neat. With this weapon system, Silpheed the Lost Planet sets itself apart from other shoot 'em ups and avoids some of the pitfalls of the genre. There are 8 stages, and the layouts and enemies can get pretty creative. It feels methodical how you weave around enemy bullets and figure out their attack patterns. The game might not be groundbreaking graphically, like previous Silpheeds, but it manages to create a ton of spectacle. I like how each level has a distinct theme that changes up gameplay a bit. It's nothing huge, but flying through a destroyed city and avoiding crumbling buildings is a nice change of pace from just being in space all the time. Oftentimes, the camera angle will change a bit too, which is pretty exciting. At first, the game seems surprisingly forgiving. You have lots of hit points, and refueling in the middle of each stage recovers some health automatically. You can restart each stage once you die, with unlimited continues, even if you have to restart from the beginning each time you die. The game is really tough sometimes, and it kinda sucks to have to restart each level, because they can get long at times, but at least the customizable weapons keep it a little more fresh once you're on your 5th attempt at a level. The issue is that there's no saves between levels. That's weird when you can restart levels an unlimited amount of times. It's like the game can't decide if it wants to have an arcade style or not. It's the type of game where you should be able to save between levels, since they could take a lot of attempts. It feels like a decision that was made to artificially pad the amount of time you spend on the game. At least it can be fixed with emulation nowadays. This is the second and final game in this video to be localized by Working Designs, but contrary to their image, the changes they made to the game are unambiguously for the better. They added analog control and actually fixed the slowdown that was present in the Japanese version of the game. Technically that makes for a harder game, but they did not change the difficulty on purpose. They didn't need to change much because the original had lots of text and voice acting in English. The story of Silpheed the Lost Planet is told by cutscenes and a sort of captain's log before each level. The best way I could describe the story is dry. It's hard to understand, but what you need to understand is that there are aliens and they're not very nice to the human race. There are also allies with their own ships. They talk to you throughout the levels in what basically amounts to Star Fox banter. The audio mixing on the dialogue is pretty bad though. It's hard to hear them at all, and the ships aren't integrated into gameplay, which makes them feel less iconic. At least they have funny accents though. The Silpheed games, from a modern perspective, are mostly characterized by the periods they released in. The original Silpheed stands out as being genuinely innovative for its time, and the Sega CD version stands out for being one of the few exclusives to that system. Looking at Silpheed the Lost Planet, it doesn't stand out too much from everything else in the genre. Every other Treasure game, and the onslaught of great PS2 titles that released the same year in North America. That's a bit of a shame, because it's still a genuinely great and imaginative game. I had fun with it, even though I'm not that familiar with its genre. It is the second of 4 space shoot-'em-ups Treasure developed, and before we get to the next one, there's a weird game to talk about, Stretch Panic. Stretch Panic released in 2001 for PS2, and it's really the first fully 3D game Treasure's made so far. A company's first jump to 3D is a big deal, because it can characterize the movement and feel of all their future 3D games moving forward. With Treasure, they decided to keep the movement and structure of their first 3D outing simple, so that they could focus on the core experience, instead of something completely grounded. And unfortunately, it leads to a game that feels half-finished. You play as a girl named Linda, and your goal is to rescue and exorcise your sisters who are being possessed by demons. It's a strange setup for a game, which fits because it's a very strange game. The character designs and art style aren't really appealing, but there is a lot of charm to them. The problem with the visuals is that it's an early PS2 game, back when they didn't look much better than PS1 games. That's fine on the surface, PS1 games are awesome, but something about the simple graphics here makes for a game that feels unfinished. It doesn't help that the game is almost entirely made up of small enclosed spaces. The game has creative ideas with its visuals, but only the very basics are in the game. The main way of attacking is with Linda's scarf, which also happens to be possessed by a demon. You move with the right analog stick, and can grab onto and stretch enemies with your scarf. You can attack by either pulling and pinching enemies, or by spinning the control stick around to fly into them. I don't usually like to complain about this, but god, the camera sucks in the game. The perspective is very zoomed in on you, and since most of the game is set in tight-knit arenas, it's hard to look around and get a grip on your surroundings. You will become very reliant on the lock-on feature. When you take damage, you're also knocked to the ground for a good second, and have to reorient yourself and lock on again, which can be annoying. I don't think any of these are deal breakers on their own, but in conjunction with each other, it gets to be a bit much. The structure of the game is built around a central hub with 12 bosses to fight. Yes, the game is basically a boss rush, and we like treasure bosses. There are technically traditional levels though, and you will need to explore them a little to get enough points to unlock the boss doors. Levels are filled with women with comically large breasts, and you need to pinch them in areas that aren't their boobs to kill them and get points. This is another way the game feels like a beta release that somehow made it to market, because that feels like a development in-joke that could have been left out of the final release. It probably single-handedly raised the age rating of the game. These sexual harassment levels are mostly free roaming, and there's not much of a challenge to them since they're for grinding points. This type of level is effective for getting you used to controls and movement at first, but going back to them after beating a few bosses isn't interesting. The bosses are easily the best parts of the game. They're pretty imaginative, and I like their designs. For most of them you can grab an attack all over, but there are certain weak points or attacks that can be countered for more damage. I like figuring out where their weak points are. The game tells you how much damage your attacks all do, so you'll want to attack multiple spots to figure out how to properly damage the boss. What the game doesn't tell you, however, is that defeating bosses doesn't actually defeat them. You have to exorcise the demon and then defeat that to actually win. To do this, you need to pull off a smart bomb attack, which you can do by grabbing onto an enemy and pressing L3 and R3 at the same time and mashing the analog triggers. The game literally never tells you this, and you can beat all the bosses without even figuring that out. To even attempt a smart bomb takes 5 points, which means you're going to be stretching the backs of many big-breasted women in your playthrough. Okay, maybe it is a little funny that's in the game now that I think about it. Technically the manual explains the smart bomb mechanic, but it is complicated, and in 2001, essential information being in the manual of the game just wasn't the expectations for games anymore. The game is more padded than those women's boobs. Why did I write that in the script? Stretch Panic is the quintessential example of a missed opportunity. If it was polished a little more, the bosses could have been really fun. There is potential in the stretch mechanics, and if the game was more of a platformer with attention to its level design, it could have been really great. Almost like a 3D version of Mischief Makers and its catch and release gameplay. You can't even jump in the game though, so it's definitely not a 3D platformer. As it stands, Stretch Panic is the weakest Treasure game so far, and it barely feels like a finished product. I love Treasure, but not literally every game they make is perfect, and that's fine because it makes their story interesting. Speaking of missed potential, around this time, Treasure had a game called Gun Beat for arcades, and it would have been a racing game, with a cartoony, slapstick style inspired by wacky races. It was received very well, and it would have been cool to see Treasure make a racing game. The lead developer left the project, and it was cancelled sometime in the early 2000s. Since it was an arcade game, I imagine releasing and developing it might have been harder than a console game. The reason I'm talking about Gun Beat now is that Treasure's next game would release on arcades in 2001, one of their most well-received games yet, Ikaruga, a sort of sequel to Radiant Silvergun that's also a shoot-'em-up, and keeps some of its mechanics while also completely changing others. Ikaruga's main gameplay mechanic is similar to the system in Silhouette Mirage. The games don't have the same directors or producers, so it's probably a coincidence, but there are some parallels. Ikaruga does it much better. Every ship in the game is either black or white, and fires black or white bullets. You have a button that changes your ship's color between black and white. You can absorb bullets that have the same color as you. One of my main criticisms of the system in Silhouette Mirage was that it didn't add much to the gameplay, but here it is absolutely additive and fundamentally changes how you weave around bullets, the cornerstone of a bullet hell experience. The game kinda makes you solve puzzles with how you navigate the complex patterns of enemy fire. You have to figure out where to move and when to switch colors, which constantly tests the limits of your reflexes. But at the same time, it gives the player more agency, and it feels merciful in this brutally hard game. You can absorb half the shots in the game. How hard can it possibly be, right? If you absorb enough bullets, you can unleash an ultimate attack to completely cover the screen with projectiles. Unlike Radiant Silvergun, there is only one way of shooting, so it's very useful. Originally, they were planning on making it so that you have a limited amount of ammo, which is restored by absorbing bullets. But that was scrapped because it was seen as too restrictive. I think that was a good call. Sometimes a game makes itself harder by making the player feel restrained and restricted, which is a valid approach. But it is quite frustrating and some players will hate it. Other times, a game makes itself hard purely by level design and not mechanics, which seems to be more Treasure style. You can still play a version of the game with that restriction though. It's called Prototype Mode, and good on you if you're willing to play it. I am definitely not. One thing that does return from Radiant Silvergun is the chain system, only with 2 colors to worry about instead of 3. And since you can't upgrade yourself, it's mostly for scoring purposes. Technically, you can get extra lives if your score is high enough, but that won't really come into play unless you're really good at getting high scores, so getting your score up by doing chains is mostly for bragging rights. This system, and the point system in general, is mostly a holdover from past arcade games and shoot 'em ups, but it's not distracting, and for the people who like getting high scores, it's good. But if you don't like focusing on your score, it's perfectly fine to not do that. I like getting chains because it's fun, but I never felt pressured to do so. You might think that the lack of upgrades and no variety in weapons makes the game more frustrating. That's not really the case, because your firepower feels perfectly adequate to all bosses and enemies in the game. Even though Ikaruga and Radiant Silvergun are technically part of the same series, they feel quite different and you can't directly compare them like that. There are fundamental differences in how approachable each game feels to a newcomer. Another huge difference is the length of the respective games. There is one tantalizing bit of information that will make you motivated to continue in Ikaruga to the point of madness. There are only 5 stages, and one playthrough takes roughly 25 minutes. It'll make you think, how hard can it be if it's that short, with all the confidence and hubris of a German World War I general telling his men they'll be home for Christmas. The game is short, but it pushes you to your absolute limit to accommodate its length, and at a certain point it demands near perfection. Playing this game over and over again, and memorizing all of its intricacies is just a part of the experience. I completely gave up on trying to get gameplay footage where I'm not constantly dying. You could technically say that this game doesn't have much content compared to other shoot 'em ups, but I think that kinda misses the point. Ikaruga is made for the hardcore shoot 'em up fan who wants to get completely engrossed in something. If you're new to shoot 'em ups, I would recommend Silvergun first. In fact, that game stuck with me just a bit more. I can't deny Ikaruga is great though, and you have to respect it. Ikaruga is shoot 'em up fans' favorite shoot 'em up. Of course, the fact that these are arcade games, and I'm reviewing their home ports, definitely changes how I talk about them. Radiant Silvergun was able to invent a genius mechanic for the home release that emulates an arcade experience while adding something new. Ikaruga was not, because it's not that type of game. Ikaruga had ports on both Dreamcast and GameCube. It's often considered to the libraries of both systems, since they didn't have very many games like it. The version I'm reviewing is the one on Steam, which is based on the Xbox 360 Live Arcade port, as evidenced by the button prompts, and the fact that your achievements are constantly displayed on one side of the screen. I mean, achievements were the hot new thing back then. It does actually fit well, since Ikaruga has a prevailing motif of pushing past your limits, and it comes up in gameplay a lot because of how hard it is. You even get a letter grade after each fight, and I've never been able to get a score higher than a C+. Radiant Silvergun had a destruction bonus mechanic, where you can hit certain parts of a boss to get a higher score, and that returns here. Although sometimes a boss can run out the clock, and get away without you destroying it at all. Since you're likely to spend more time avoiding bullets than shooting, you'll have to pay attention to the destruction bonus if you care about your score. I promise I don't mean this as an insult when I say it, but the most fun part of the game to me is looking at the art in the art gallery mode. The art was done by an artist named Yasushi Suzuki, and something about it is so beautiful. The art is dark and gritty, but at the same time vibrant and incredibly full of motion. They have a three-dimensional quality to them since they're so detailed, and I would frame any of the pieces in the game. Suzuki has done art for both Sin and Punishment titles, and some of the mechs in Xenoblade Chronicles, but I'd say Ikaruga has my favorite art. There's so much character to it. The visual style of the actual game is good, but these illustrations are just legendary. Ikaruga technically has a story, but it's simple and isn't really featured in the game itself. The most we get are little poems before each level. I'm using the term poem loosely here. It's poorly translated, but also the kind of thing where that almost makes it cooler. I can tell this was the case where they put English text in the Japanese version of a game and just didn't change it for localization. The menus are also a little weird in a charming sort of way. I don't know how to describe it, but older games that were re-released via the Xbox 360 Live Arcade often had menus that were awkward. It doesn't affect the quality of the game at all, it's just charming and silly. Ikaruga has a reputation as being Treasure's magnum opus. It managed to both change the gameplay of shoot-em-ups in a fundamental way, and become known by fans of the genre as one of the best. I wouldn't recommend it as your introduction to shoot-em-ups, but I can still recognize it as a classic. I will be playing the game more often once this video is done, and I fully anticipate that I might enjoy it a lot better if I play some more shoot-em-ups than go back to it. For now, when I inevitably rank all these games at the end of the video, it might be lower than you'd expect. I love making controversial decisions. Ikaruga was planned to be the second in a trilogy, but in the end that didn't really happen. The closest they got was a successor called Kokuga, a game that was developed by Ikaruga's director at a completely different company in 2013. I'm not sure if it's actually that similar, or if it only seems that way because it has a similar title. Even if I wanted to review it here, Kokuga wasn't released in Canada despite being released in the US. Not that it would matter much, since it's a download exclusive 3DS game. Apparently the director is working on a new shoot-em-up, so maybe that'll be like Ikaruga. The Game Boy Advance released around the time Ikaruga came out, and Treasure would go on to have an amazing string of games on the console. You might expect that developing for a handheld system would come with its own challenges, but they went about it remarkably well. The GBA was in some ways a throwback to the SNES and Genesis era that Treasure first found their footing in, and this era was a chance for Treasure to remind people of their legacy while also pushing it forwards on home consoles. Do you guys remember how Treasure made licensed games before? Well, they're doing it again, and this time it's an unexpected property, Tiny Toons Adventures. It's not as surprising as McDonald's, but not exactly expected either. Konami developed some Tiny Toons Adventures games before, but as far as I know, no Treasure staff was involved with them. Treasure's Tiny Toons game is pretty obscure since it only officially released in Europe, despite being developed in Japan. This is Tiny Toons Adventures Buster's Bad Dream, released in 2002 for Game Boy Advance. Buster's Bad Dream is another high-flying, chaotic beat-em-up, which is both limited and enhanced by the technology it's on. You play as Buster, who is indeed having some bad dreams, and you fight through a ton of enemies. The fighting is quite solid. You can do long strings of combos in the air, as well as knock enemies into each other for more damage, making for a beat 'em up that fits the Looney Tunes brand perfectly. In addition, you also have special moves and assists from the other Tiny Toons Adventures characters, which can be pretty helpful. You can essentially use each assist as much as you want, the only limit is their health, so you can spam assists, you just have to be conscious of where they are on screen. Sneezer is probably the most useful one. He can stun enemies with his sneeze. I don't know who any of the characters in the game actually are, I am not caught up on the Tiny Toons Adventures lore. You have access to special moves as well, which are limited since they do a ton of damage to a bunch of enemies on screen. Think of them as being like a fighting game's super moves. The locations and backgrounds are a little generic, and most of the enemies aren't too special either. I wouldn't call them bad, just a little basic. It was Treasure's first game on the system after all. There are also bosses which are fun. The biggest difference with them is mostly just that you can't take them out in one long combo string, which keeps gameplay fresh. There's 4 stages comprised of 3 levels each, without much variation on the core gameplay loop. I don't think the gameplay gets stale, but it does make for a simple experience. One thing to know about this game is that it's very hard. This was still in the era where licensed kids games could be brutally challenging. Some enemies, like pumas, have attacks with a lot of range, and even though there aren't very many stages, you will have to do them over and over again. Sometimes the game tries to implement platforming sections as well, which are terrible. Pressing up to jump, instead of having a dedicated jump button, never results in a good platforming experience, especially when you're facing Mega Man style teleporting blocks and an onslaught of enemies. Tiny Toons Adventures Buster's Bad Dream is a game stripped down to its essentials. It feels like a full release, and it is substantial enough, but basic compared to Treasure's other games. The fighting has style and flourish, and it is more than enough to entertain you throughout its runtime. It's worth a playthrough for that alone, even if I would recommend plenty of other games over it. Buster's Bad Dream is best looked back upon with hindsight. The ideal way to enjoy it is by downloading a ROM or finding a cheap copy and checking it out for an afternoon. That might sound harsh, but that's just the type of game it is. I'd call it a hidden gem, and not bad for their first effort on a console. Treasure developed a second Tiny Toons Adventure game in 2002 as well. Tiny Toons Adventures Defenders of the Universe for PlayStation 2. Tiny Toons Adventures certainly got a lot of video games made after 1992 for a show that ended in 1992. Defenders of the Universe was cancelled for unknown reasons, despite being fully completed, and the ROM is available online, so I may as well check it out. I can't say I expected it, but this is an officially licensed Tiny Toons Adventures version of Rakugaki Showtime. Since Rakugaki Showtime was also pulled off of store shelves, I can't help but think this gameplay style is cursed or something. It plays almost identically, down to all the items from Rakugaki Showtime returning. The gameplay style of that game was good, and I am glad to see it return, even get expanded on in some ways. Once you think about it, the gameplay style fits Looney Tunes perfectly well. The biggest change is that you have a full story mode instead of an arcade mode, and the levels aren't just simple arenas with a few enemies to face. Sometimes the level might have navigation challenges, or add more clever elements to make it more of a beat 'em up than a fighting game. Another change is the addition of money, which you can use to buy items that heal you throughout the game. I have mixed opinions on this, because while it does enhance the gameplay, the healing items are purchased simply by walking into them. If you want to save your money and not buy an expensive power-up, you have to actively avoid a whole area so you don't accidentally buy it. At least money isn't scarce, so it's not too annoying. The story of the game is easily the best part. There are fully voice-acted cutscenes that are actually very funny.
Long ago in a galaxy really not that far away, when you think about how big space is, I mean it's big. Really big, huge even. A couple of million light years, that's nothing compared to space. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, the Gold Star.
It is a game based on a dumb kid show, but there were moments that made me laugh. The voice cast is actually really effective. Some of them return from the show, and I imagine the humor wouldn't have worked nearly as well if the delivery wasn't so on point. If this is how the actual show was written, I could see it being one of the kids show parents would actually like to watch. The plot is simple. a villain called Montana Max is trying to take over a planet called the Gold Star, which is inhabited by some conveniently ball-shaped aliens who recruit the Tiny Toons to help them. It's funny that the planet in this game is referred to as a star, because that means a Tiny Toons Adventures game was affected by the nuances of Japanese to English translation. Treasure's next game is another licensed title that was released at the tail end of 2002 for Game Boy Advance. Except Wikipedia will tell you it was 2003, because they like to lie to you. It's Hajime no Ippo the Fighting, based on the boxing manga of the same name. We've got a boxing game, and it is a very good one indeed. It's not hard to see parallels with Hajime no Ippo and Punch-Out, since it's a first-person boxing game on a Nintendo system. They have basic similarities. You dodge attacks in a similar way, and the rounds affect gameplay in a similar way too. They are quite different though. And get real, those are just things boxing already has. The main difference between Punch-Out and Hajime no Ippo, besides the license obviously, is the three-dimensional aspect of Hajime no Ippo. It doesn't look very three-dimensional, but you're able to walk forward towards your opponent or backwards away from them, and your strategies can change according to that. Sometimes an enemy can put you on the back foot, which is really dangerous, and forces you to dodge like crazy. Other times you'll leave them dodging all your attacks. You have to be very conscious of how close you are to your opponent too. It's quite risky to try to attack at far or medium range instead of going up close. This creates a game that truly feels like a first-person fighting game, with all the depth a traditional fighter has. Each character in the game has access to their own special moves that can change the course of a fight as well. Stuff like an uppercut or a liver blow. I really enjoy how you have to be clever about where you use these attacks. Weaving around an opponent's attacks to find just the perfect opportunity to use your special move is a ton of fun. Another pretty genius system in the game is how your life bar is handled. Every time you take damage, you take both red and yellow damage. Red damage stays permanently, while yellow health goes away over time. If you've taken lots of damage, you might need to take a break to catch your breath and recover, or try to run out the clock until the next round. You can even take a risk by waiting for some yellow health to recover before getting up, when you're down for the count. Hajime no Ippo is the thinking man's boxing game. It simulates boxing in a realistic way, and every little aspect is so cleverly thought out. I would be very surprised if some of Treasure's staff weren't boxing fans, or at least big fans of Hajime no Ippo. The main meat of the game is an arcade mode, where you fight through a bunch of boxers from across the series. Every character you fight in this game is approached just a little bit differently, and those differences feel realistic to the sport. You might get an enemy who is an absolute monster at dealing yellow damage, but doesn't do too much red damage, forcing you to play more defensively and wait it out a little bit. You might get an opponent who deals more red damage, but does less overall, or maybe even an opponent who doesn't deal much damage, but takes a lot of hits to take out. Going back to the Punch-Out comparison, that game has you look at an opponent's animations to find their tell and exploit their fatal flaw. In Hajime no Ippo, you gradually become acquainted with your opponent as you fight and figure out their strengths and weaknesses that way. You can actually play as any of the boxers in the game, and while the core gameplay mostly remains the same, you do have access to different special moves when you're playing as them. There's a multiplayer mode as well, where you can fight another person and play as any of the boxers in the game. You'll need the link cable for that though, so good luck. Each of the characters look a little similar if you're not familiar with the source material, but they do have their quirks that make them distinctive, especially with their big sprites that cover up a screen. Unlike Punch-Out, Hajime no Ippo on GBA does not feature any racial stereotypes. Judging by the little I know about Hajime no Ippo source material though, it definitely has those. Hajime no Ippo mirrors boxing in a lot of ways. At first, it just looks like shallow, dumb, violent action, dudes hitting each other over and over again. When you look at it, it's a stressful experience with all sorts of hidden layers of strategy and mechanics that you might not have even considered. You will probably get beat up learning its intricacies. What a big swing this game is. It's so unique and completely original compared to anything Treasure's ever made. These kinds of games are what make the GBA's library so interesting. It is very deserving of the title Hidden Gem. A game this good exists, people just don't talk about it. Isn't that crazy? Hajime no Ippo is well within the list of games in this video I consider a must-play. Treasure's next title brings us back to the realm of home consoles. Treasure had developed a working relationship with Nintendo after they collaborated on Sin and Punishment. Now, Treasure would get the chance to work on a Nintendo IP, Wario Land. In 2003, Wario World was released, fully developed by Treasure and published by Nintendo. While it is technically a Wario Land game, it's quite different. For one, it's in 3D and features more beat-em-up elements. This is the first fully fledged 3D platformer Treasure made. Every time I look back on it, it feels strange that it was them who developed it. Wario World was the only Treasure game I've played before making this review series. I had this game as a kid, I just haven't replayed it for at least a decade and a half. Ever since I first tried Gunstar Heroes over a year ago for this series, I was curious to see how Wario World played. Treasure games have never been particularly long, and Wario World is no exception. There are 4 worlds, each with just 2 levels and a boss. Obviously you're playing as Wario. The setup for the game is that an evil black jewel from his treasure heap has taken away all his gold, and now Wario's gotta get it back and beat him up or something. There's a central hub world from which you access the subworlds. It doesn't really serve much of a purpose, but it is pretty, and better than selecting each level from a menu. These kinds of liminal spaces in video games have a tendency to make anyone who's played them really nostalgic, and this hub world does bring back memories just when I walk through it. I can practically picture the old beat up light blue lazy boy I sat on to play this game when I was like 5, probably because we still have it. You can look at treasure you've collected in the game, and even unlock some micro games from WarioWare in this hub world, so it does have some purpose to it besides aesthetics. It kind of reminds me of Stretch Panic and its hub world. I do really like the look of this game. It's kind of dark but goofy, and something about it just feels uncanny to me. Maybe it's the way the levels are laid out more like corridors, unlike the 3D Mario games that were out at the time. Or maybe it's the fact that there aren't really characters with dialogue besides sprites, that gives you guidance if you rescue them. This is also where I should mention what might just be the most remembered part about Wario World, the pause screen music. Unironically, this might be the game's biggest legacy. Sorry. The beat-em-up elements feel pretty important compared to your average 3D Nintendo platformer, but at the same time, not too important. A lot of the actual challenge comes from beating up basic enemies, and sometimes enemies that are specifically meant to block progression. Something like a tree where you have to pick up its fruit and throw it back, for example. It's basic and it does the job. But Wario's moveset is surprisingly fleshed out since you can punch, ground pound, grapple, even shoulder bash. Wario Land and games inspired by it like Pizza Tower sometimes give you unlimited hit points, and Wario World operates on a semi-similar principle. You have hit points and can get a game over, but you can use coins to revive yourself every time you die. Coins are very plentiful, so you probably won't be running out. You can also buy garlic to restore health at certain points as well. Wario World is not only about platforming or making it to the goal necessarily. You're Wario, you want to hoard as much gold as possible. Losing money is basically just as bad as losing your life. Each stage has a mini-boss and each world has a boss at the end, which makes Wario World a fairly boss-heavy game. Usually they just have one attack that leaves them weak, which you're supposed to exploit. Gameplay-wise, they are fine. The real standout is just how weird their designs are. I mean, look at them. One of the bosses is a giant flying baby doll. It's a little silly. Also, side note, as a kid I always thought Black Jewel was supposed to be the jewel on King Boo's crown, and that Wario worked with King Boo as a business partner or something, which is how he amassed his wealth. I will now headcanon that as the reason King Boo does not wear that crown outside of the Luigi's Mansion series. The main focus of the game isn't fighting or platforming, but rather treasure hunting. Each level requires a certain amount of jewels to progress, which you collect in the stage, and there are other types of treasure you'll be on the lookout for if you want an ending that doesn't suck. Coming through each level for secrets is what it's all about, and it's the most fun part of the experience. Wario World has a very different rhythm to other 3D platformers. Most treasure is found in chests that only appear once you hit certain switches in the levels, so you might need to do a slight bit of backtracking in each stage. Really, the game just makes you think three-dimensionally, even though the levels are mostly corridors. The only mandatory pickups are red jewels, and there's a very specific process to getting them. Each level features trapdoors that you often ground pound through to get to a platforming challenge for a red jewel. These challenges often make use of the 3D space more so than the level design itself. This is where Treasure can have fun making some weird, abstract areas and just get a little creative. They're the only areas where you can move the camera. It's very simple. I liken it to the way the camera controls in Super Mario 64. I would compare these challenge areas, actually, to some of the areas from Super Mario Sunshine, but much shorter. Usually they only last a few seconds since there's lots of them. It can sometimes feel weird to get used to since they interrupt regular levels, but they are fun. When you're properly searching for each of the collectibles in the level, it can take a solid 20 minutes per level, which really isn't that insubstantial. Each world took me roughly an hour, and there's definitely the potential to go back to each level to fully complete them if that's what you want to do. The game features these glue ball things. There's spheres you can stick onto, and yeah, that's just straight up a thing from Mischief Makers in 3D. It's not like a super original concept, but I have a pattern recognizing brain. Wario World had the potential to be one of Treasure's most remembered titles, simply because of the IP, but it doesn't seem to be very remembered at all. Most of that is because of the time period it comes from. The GameCube was seen as unimpressive in its early years, because many of its titles were shorter and simplistic, like Wario World. Something like Luigi's Mansion had a critical reappraisal once the series got more entries, but for Wario World that never really happened. It was released in an environment where there was a lot of pressure on it, and yeah, it's a good game, but not a technical showcase or a system seller. The early 2000s was a very Wario-heavy time. Wario Land 3 and 4 released in 2000 and 2001 respectively, and Wario World launched the same year as the first WarioWare. Wario World was somewhat lost in the shuffle. If you are really itching for a Wario experience, his greatest achievement, Wario Land 4 on the Game Boy Advance, is probably your best bet, but World is still a valuable Wario title regardless. Treasure released another game for GameCube in 2003, Dragon Drive D-Master's Shot. 2003 was an eventful year for Treasure, with them releasing games on both handhelds and home consoles. Dragon Drive D-Master's Shot was a Japan exclusive, and it's based on a manga series called Dragon Drive. I have never heard of that series in my life, but looking at it, it kinda looks like a Digimon clone. One of those series that was definitely made to sell merchandise and be a multimedia project. I apologize to any Dragon Drive fans who might be watching. D-Master Shot is another third-person shooter, so once again it's a fairly simple game we're looking at. Since it was a Japan exclusive, and it isn't voice acted in English, I can't really judge the game objectively. Maybe it's the funniest game to ever exist, and I just can't understand the appeal without seeing the cutscenes. Or maybe it's a serious commentary on war that requires the gameplay to be mostly passable. I don't know. I do know that the gameplay is mostly passable. You play as a dragon shooting crowds of enemies through 16 fairly short levels. It's about 3 hours in total, which is pretty in line with Treasure's other games lengthwise. You have the ability to lock onto enemies and have your bullets home in on them, so dodging around and prioritizing what target to take out make up most of the gameplay rather than the aiming itself. The right and left analog triggers control whether you fly towards or away from enemies, and you also have a dodge and a block button. The gameplay is fun enough. I like that movement has a complex, mechanical feel to it, which makes it inherently engaging. It reminds me of a mech shooter game. There's lots of parallels with Zone of the Enders in the game's design philosophy and movement. There are occasional bosses in the game too, and they are welcome since they do change up the gameplay, and some of them have cool designs, but they're not really a highlight necessarily. Most of them are just damage sponge versions of regular enemies. Really, the biggest problem with the game is just that there's not much here. The gameplay stays the same for so long that it gets stale. To be fair, sometimes the shooter gameplay transitions to a fixed camera shooter, which is different, but also it's even more simple. These two gameplay styles are basically described as Zone of the Enders and Panzer Dragoon. And yeah, I'm not saying Treasure copied them or anything, but it does pretty much just feel like the gameplay of those two games. I can't help but think of Sin and Punishment, another Treasure shoot 'em up that was Japan exclusive. Sin and Punishment is about the same length, but keeps its gameplay much more interesting with set pieces that meaningfully change gameplay often, and when the gameplay switches styles, it enhances the game. There are better ways of doing what D-Master Shot was doing. The game has a pretty extensive story and makes use of anime cutscenes, so I presume it focuses on appealing towards fans of the source material. I've gotta say, Dragon Drive only has like 14 volumes and 38 episodes, which feels short for a multimedia series like this with its target demographic. Obviously, I can't really criticize this part of the game, but I do suspect it makes up for some of its simplicity gameplay-wise. I attempted to translate some of the text with Google Translate, but it unsurprisingly did not go very well. I tried to enter Kirby and Hills Jotaro in katakana, and I ended up naming myself Krabe-e Haruyo. It actually sounds kinda cool. Dragon Drive D-Master Shot is really emblematic of some of the problems in Treasure's 3D console games of this generation. They feel short and not like full games. Treasure has never made a game that takes longer than 10 hours to beat, which is usually fine, because their quality gameplay makes up for it. But when the core gameplay loop is a little underbaked, or there's not enough creative ideas to keep it fresh, it can be bland. The games they make for older consoles, or for handhelds, have been way better, because shorter games like these were the expectations for those consoles, and Treasure managed to understand the consoles perfectly. I don't think D-Master Shot is a bad game by any means. It just doesn't feel like much more than a pretty good licensed game, which was disappointing for Treasure when they're so famous for making such good, licensed games out of random properties. D-Master Shot could be described as the most forgettable out of all of Treasure's titles, even if it is fun sometimes. I'm getting a little tired, but don't worry because Treasure would cap off 2003 with one of their best games ever. It was very much a return to some of their previous games, adapting the beat-em-up engine of Buster's Bad Dream, and mixing up some run-and-gun shooter gameplay for good measure. It was even primarily designed by Mitsuru Yaida, who designed Gunstar Heroes. This is Astro Boy Omega Factor for Game Boy Advance. It may be a licensed game, but this time it's an anime people in the West actually know about. Astro Boy is a classic too. It's gotta be like one of two anime someone's grandparents would know about. The game was published by Sega, which is the first time the two companies had partnered since 1996. It was even co-developed by Hitmaker, a core studio of Sega. Both Hitmaker and Treasure looked to past games like Gunstar Heroes and Alien Soldier as inspiration, while mixing in elements of the Astro Boy brand. Omega Factor is a culmination of both the legacies of Treasure and Astro Boy. Hey look! Gunstar, like the name of the game that Treasure made. The closest we'll ever get to having Gunstar Heroes on Game Boy Advance. Astro Boy Omega Factor was created as a tie-in to the 2003 Astro Boy reboot, and to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the original TV show. Sega also made a PS2 Astro Boy game, developed by Sonic Team, but that was just kind of okay. Omega Factor also features lots of references to other Osamu Tezuka works, and it does it in a really interesting way that's done primarily to celebrate the legacy of one of the greatest comic creators of all time. The moment-to-moment gameplay is mostly beat-em-up sections, which are a ton of fun. They have a similar engine to Buster's Bad Dream, but here it's a little more refined and less completely chaotic. The fact that you can knock enemies into each other makes it very satisfying. You have both a 3-hit combo, as well as a kick attack, and the kick attack can be used more effectively to knock enemies away if they're weak enough. What really makes the combat interesting, however, are the abilities around the punching and kicking. You can zip all across the screen in any direction, and often this is your main way of dodging certain attacks or projectiles. The small screen size makes for a game filled with constant, intimate combat, which works very well with the ability to knock enemies into each other and to fly around them. The sound design is great, because when you knock multiple enemies into each other, it comes out in escalating xylophone notes, which are just super satisfying. Your other main method of attack is a laser, but it's pretty weak. It's more suited to bosses and flying sections, rather than strictly just generic enemies. Just like Buster's Bad Dream, you have super moves, except this time they're restored quickly enough that you'll want to make liberal use of them. You can either fire a barrage of bullets, capable of damaging all enemies on screen, or a superpowered version of your laser beam. They are, once again, very satisfying to use. Sometimes the game puts you in situations where you can block projectiles, or stop yourself from being cornered by enemies with one of the super moves, which encourages you to play cleverly, and overall they make for an even deeper beat-em-up experience. Horizontal shooter sections make up a small portion of the game as well. Here, you only have access to your laser beam, and it's weird to get used to. It takes a second or so of contact for the laser to do much damage, and you can't have the laser always on, which is different from how lasers typically work in these types of games. I didn't like these sections as much as the beat-em-up for that reason, but they are still well designed. You can still dodge attacks by zipping around, which can prove to be very useful here. The game is a pretty good challenge, and most levels would take you at least a couple of attempts, but it hardly feels overly punishing when checkpoints are so forgiving. It's a very short game too, so a little challenge is practically necessary. As we'll see later on, the game has a very interesting way of padding out its runtime. The standout aspect of the game are definitely the bosses. They're so imaginative and carry on the tradition of being big, screen-sized giant robots. Lots of them are very difficult too. The fact that you can zip around is a godsend, especially because you can sometimes essentially teleport behind bosses. Some of the bosses are fought in the horizontal shooter sections instead of beat-em-ups, including one against an artificial sun, which is a fantastic set piece. The end of the game is a string of fights against 5 bosses, each one being absolutely exhilarating and really good. It's an Astro Boy game, gotta have some Mega Man influence in there. Pluto, who you may be familiar with from the Astro Boy reimagining of the same name, is the boss that serves as the end of this gauntlet. In a game so short, it is impressive how jam-packed it is with bosses, and in a game so jam-packed with bosses, it is impressive how quality they all are. Actually, this game has a ton of characters in it. The story is kind of a big deal in this game, convoluted as it may be. The story jumps around rapidly between all kinds of different set pieces, not just based on Astro Boy, but works from all over Osamu Tezuka's portfolio. The game speedruns Astro's origin story and immediately puts you into crazy conflicts. At one point you'll be in Antarctica, celebrating the world's first robot president. Then you'll be transported 40,000 years in the past to the ancient city of Mu. All kinds of random characters are being introduced frequently, and I would struggle to call the plot of the game traditionally coherent, but it is actually very good for what they were going for. There's just enough here to suggest a further relationship between characters. And as much as I like a fleshed out narrative, sometimes video games have you imagining what relationships between characters could be like, rather than operate like a traditional narrative, playing to the medium's strengths by giving more agency to the player. It doesn't work for every game, but for a simpler one like Omega Factor, it's effective. Sometimes when a story is adapted right from the source material, it can be pretty emotionally effective too. The storyline with the first robot president and Lord Deadcross who wants to assassinate him stands out as a pretty memorable part of the game. As does the fight with Pluto. I guess this might be some light spoilers. Osamu Tezuka has written and illustrated over 700 manga volumes in his life, and his works are known for something called the Osamu Tezuka star system. Characters from one work can reappear in completely different roles, not unlike an actor who can appear in multiple movies. Astro Boy Omega Factor is an excuse to bring together all these characters. You'll constantly be meeting new NPCs, ally or enemy alike, and they will be added to a big database of characters. To someone unfamiliar with his works, it can be a good learning tool, and for someone who is familiar with them, it's just constant fan service. There's a gameplay purpose to it as well. Astro Boy has 7 forces, and you can upgrade one of them every time you meet a new character. Yes, they literally call it 7 forces. I know Astro Boy does have 7 powers in the manga, but like, come on. That is a great example of gameplay narrative synergy, because it means that Astro Boy grows and levels up by meeting new people and having new experiences. Everybody, whether they're evil or good, enriches his life and makes this robot a deeper and more complex person. It is such a simple gameplay mechanic that communicates such a beautiful message about the nature of life that could only be done in a video game. I should also mention that the localization for this game is great. The game was localized in-house at Treasure and has some gameplay changes and tweaks that generally make it the better version of the game. The 2003 Astro Boy show took a while to get localized, so this game and Astro Boy for PS2 took a while to get localized too, so they could tie into its release. Now, I thought by this point I was done with the game, but not really. After an excellent boss fight against Pluto and an emotional send-off to the character, spoiler alert, the literal God of Judgment destroys the entire world. That is not how I expected the game to end. But then Astro is revived by a phoenix, and you have to complete the game again, this time meeting everybody to get the true ending. You can't just select stages either to get 100%, you have to play the game over again to get the true ending. That probably sounds like a pacing nightmare, but you know what? This game is short and good enough that when it was over, I felt like completing it again. It might be some pretty blatant padding, but the game is fun enough and has such an energy to it that I didn't mind. The actual level design of this second go around doesn't change much, but you will be stronger, so how you approach it might be a little bit different. The dialogue is a bit different too. The game knows you've played it before, so Astro will speak to some characters like he already knows them, leaving to comment on how robots are getting smarter these days or something. There's also more new characters to meet this time around, so it is fresh in some places. Astro Boy Omega Factor is a game so nice you beat it twice. It's one of these games I would recommend to anyone, and I think it has a solid chance of being considered the best Game Boy Advance game. It's one of Treasure's best games yet. Now, it is important to note that Treasure is not one coherent unit. The nature of this video means that I kinda have to talk about them that way, which isn't accurate. Treasure is made up of lots of different employees, many of which have different starts to the industry. Most games only had a few staff working on them. This also means that if a game isn't as good, it's not that anyone's standards are getting lower. At the very least, Astro Boy Omega Factor proves they've still got it. Treasure's next game ping-pongs back to consoles and back to good old Konami, the company that Treasure sort of sprung up from in the first place. Treasure changes publishers so often that they ended up returning to their roots both with Sega and Konami. Their next game was Gradius V, released on PlayStation 2 in 2004. Gradius is a horizontal shooter series that's one of Konami's most successful franchises. Nowadays, when Konami continues their legacy series, it's usually by outsourcing the development to other developers. But back then, Treasure taking on a series like this was a big deal, and it shows the amount of clout they had built up in the shooter space. Since this isn't Treasure's first rodeo with shoot-em-ups, the usual hallmarks are all here. Huge bosses, crushing difficulty, and above all else, memorable level design and set pieces. Gradius is known for sections where you move through tunnels, as well as featuring big, bizarre, biomechanical mutant things that serve as enemies. There's just a lot of big, fleshy things in Gradius, and that serves Treasure's design and the general art style of the game well. Of course, the fact that it's horizontal instead of vertical changes aspects of how you approach the game as well, specifically your positioning and how enemies are designed. So it feels different from Treasure's other shoot-em-ups, but for the most part, the fundamentals are here and designed really well. If you like shoot-em-ups, Gradius V won't be any different. Gradius V features a simple story. Midway through the game, you're assisted by a pilot in a ship that looks identical to yours, and he tells you that you both must destroy the cores of an alien spaceship simultaneously to win. Near the end of the game, you go through a time portal, and it turns out that that time pilot was the future version of yourself. Neat, I guess. It's not much more than kinda cute, because the story clearly isn't the focus, but it is kind of fun to experience more than just the shooting, I suppose. Now, as you might remember, Gradius inspired the Treasure devs in a roundabout sort of way in their decision to make Radiant Silvergun. Specifically, they were annoyed by the frustration of losing power-ups every time you die. In Gradius, you have a generic shot by default, but you can get extra missiles, lasers, and other power-ups by picking them up from defeated enemies. You lose all your power-ups after a death, which can be pretty frustrating. It basically adds more layers of punishment on top of the punishment of already dying, and some sections can be extremely difficult without power-ups. Treasure fixes some of the jank around this mechanic, but they also lean into it to make it even more frustrating. You can choose between several spreads of power-ups, and to get the power-ups you want, you have to work a little. Every time you pick up a power-up, the first item on the list will be highlighted, and if you pick up a second power-up item, the second item will be highlighted, etc., etc. Usually the more powerful power-ups are near the end of the list, so you have to pick up more items to get them. It's equivalent to something like the chain system from Silvergun or the polarity system from Ikaruga, because it fundamentally shifts how you think about shooting and adds depth to the gameplay. You'll constantly be on the lookout for ways you can get more power-ups, and making your ideal build of ship feels like a puzzle. If you want a force field to absorb an extra hit for you, you'll have to hold out until you can get enough power-ups to activate it. If you want lots of extra shots, on the other hand, you'll have to focus on exactly how much power-ups to collect for your ideal goal. Some power-ups stack, while others don't, so if you activate a power-up that doesn't stack, you'll have to be careful not to activate it more than once. Even just figuring out how to collect the things adds layers to your strategy as well. Usually you'll have to defeat enemies of a different color, or take out a whole wave of enemies to get one in the first place. Sometimes the game throws tons of power-ups at you, meaning you can stock up on them, but you have to be careful that you don't collect too much, since that can reset the list, and you'll activate the relatively easy to get speed power-up instead of the more powerful ones. This power-up system was cleverly thought out, revitalizing a system that was almost 20 years old at this point, while also making it more frustrating. Yeah, it's not all that fun to build yourself up and lose it after just one death, and then die more because you're underpowered. But you know what? Games aren't always supposed to be all fun all the time. Gradius is a series about powering up to the point that you feel like you're breaking the game, only to get humbled hard, then build yourself back up again. Or at least try to. Yeah, it's pretty frustrating, but that makes the moments where it's not satisfying. Gradius just loves to play with your feelings, and refining its system instead of replacing it is the best way Treasure could have made a sequel. They did make some changes to make it less frustrating in other ways though. There aren't any spots that will be basically impossible when underpowered, and your hurt box is deliberately made less big to allow for moving between bullets more often. Sometimes I dodge a bunch of bullets and end up being genuinely surprised I did that. Not always though, it's still a very hard game, and even though it's more approachable than other shoot 'em ups, it's still crushingly difficult. This was the last shoot 'em up Treasure would ever make, and yet it is a really good one that carries on the legacy of both Treasure's shoot 'em ups and the Gradius franchise. The next two games Treasure made were both sequels to classic titles, Advance Guardian Heroes and Gunstar Super Heroes, both for Game Boy Advance in 2004 and 2005 respectively. I kinda would have expected them to do Gunstar first, whatever. Treasure hasn't ever made a direct sequel to one of their games before, so this is a new avenue for them. Part of the reason they spun off from Konami in the first place was because they were too reliant on sequels and franchises. Well, let's see how it goes, starting with Advance Guardian Heroes. This time, the game wasn't published by Sega at all.
Not owned by Sega.
Of course we're not owned by Sega. We're owned by Ubisoft.
No.
Disclaimer, that was just a dumb meme. The property is still owned by Sega, they just licensed it out to Ubisoft. Do you ever just play a game and come to a dawning realization of, oh no, it's bad? That's Advance Guardian Heroes, the worst Treasure game by far. This isn't a game I respect but isn't for me. No, it's shit from a butt. The game starts with a pretty convoluted text crawl explaining how the previous games' heroes were split up. Half of them joined the side of a being called the Sky Spirit, and half didn't. This is important because you play as a new hero fighting the Sky Spirit. Sometimes the heroes of the last game will appear to help you out or act as bosses. The story doesn't matter much, especially because the game no longer offers multiple branching story paths. It is also just as poorly translated as the first game. Quality control at Ubisoft? Never. Despite how harsh I'm being, I don't have that many problems with the story. It's a good way of following up the original Guardian Heroes while not being a rehash, and getting boss fights against the protagonists of that game is really cool. This is a pretty different game from Guardian Heroes, but it reuses elements from that game in ways that are neat on paper. Its problems lie more in the gameplay. The original Guardian Heroes had 3 layers of game you jumped in between, but Advance is more of a traditional beat 'em up with free movement. There's also an attempt at some of the gameplay elements in Buster's Bad Dream and Astro Boy Omega Factor, where you can dash around the screen, but it's slow moving and it doesn't work quite as well. In fact, the game is really slow in general, and it doesn't feel very good. You can use a dive kick move though, which is mildly satisfying I suppose. You also have a magic move, allowing you to fire elemental spells, but it does have limited MP. It can also be used as a counter or as a block. Some enemies even require you to use it as a counter to defeat them. I don't like how it feels, to be honest. The timing is skewed, and most of the time countering an enemy just leaves you open to a bunch of other enemies' attacks. The real problem with the combat is just how slow it is. It makes the game really boring, and the moment-to-moment gameplay isn't fun. You move at a sluggish pace, and racking up combos doesn't feel good. The difficulty balancing is just as bad. The original Guardian Heroes gave you a CPU-controlled ally if you weren't playing co-op, which was needed, because the series is known for having a shit ton of enemies and chaos all over the screen. This is not a luxury afforded to you in Advance Guardian Heroes, despite the fact that co-op is available, and it makes for a crushingly difficult game. Worst of all, if you die, you have to start at the beginning of a stage with the same amount of health. If that's a small amount of health, I guess you're screwed. I hate that because what's the point? How do I even get better if I die from every attack? It should have been immediately fixed at playtesting. I swallowed my pride and switched to easy mode, only to find that it completely trivialized the game. MP is unlimited, so the challenge is just deleted when you can infinitely spam counters. This game's either way too hard or way too easy. It has never heard of a normal mode, and it's got truly awful difficulty balancing. I forgot to mention, if you die, you will be given the option to sell your soul to the devil, yes really, and it allows you to assume devil mode, which turns you brown. It's lame. The form gives you invulnerability for 5 minutes, and after that time you die, returning back to when you first assumed devil form. I genuinely can't think of any reason someone would want this. You can't progress at all with the feature on. It's pointless. What makes it even worse is that every time you die, you have to listen to the devil's dialogue even if you have no intention of accepting his bargain. Every time you die. It's the lamest attempt at making a game easier ever. There's a good amount of characters, although most of them are only unlocked after clearing the campaign. You can use them in the campaign now, unlike the original Guardian Heroes, which is nice. You only get 3 characters to start with, who are basically identical. It's lame how you don't get a whole party with different compositions to start. The game does have some interesting spectacle though. The art style and graphics look nice. It leans more into a sci-fi theme than the original game. Guardian Heroes had robots and whatnot, but it mostly confined itself to medieval settings. Advanced Guardian Heroes has levels on futuristic roads with skyscrapers, which I don't quite understand. I would have preferred if they stuck to medieval settings with the occasional giant robot. I've made it clear I don't like Advanced Guardian Heroes. Many things went wrong, and overall it just didn't have the care of other Treasure games. It's pretty disappointing for a company I love so much to have made such big mistakes in such a baffling way, especially when a game like this should have been a slam dunk with their experience. I could speculate on a bunch of reasons why this happened, but look, there's no super secret, ultra secret reason it turned out bad. I think they just made mistakes, and it made for Treasure's only bad game. But look on the bright side, there's another G-Blank Heroes game that got a sequel right afterwards. This time Sega didn't pawn off the publishing duties to a different company. Take that as a good omen, cause Treasure is back to being really, really good. One of the things I actually appreciated about Advanced Guardian Heroes was that it avoided being a rehash of the original. Well, Gunstar Heroes is about as rehash as it gets, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a soft reboot, set years after the original Gunstar Heroes, but using roughly the same story with the same character names. In terms of the gameplay, it's a borderline remake, because with the exception of an all-new opening stage, every level is a parallel to something from Gunstar Heroes, reusing the exact same concepts, and even bringing back bosses or set pieces directly from the original. Don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of original ideas in the game. There's new content, new bosses, and even stuff like a vertical shoot-'em-up section. It is a new game, but it's mostly building off Gunstar Heroes, and if you played that game recently, I'd wait until it's not fresh in your mind to play superheroes. When you play this game, you are basically constantly reminded of another game. It means that in some places the game shines, but others it feels unoriginal. There are 2 notable things Gunstar Heroes does better than the original: visuals and the system for restarting levels. In Gunstar Heroes, dying causes you to restart a level unless it's at the midway point, which is perfectly fine, it does its job, but here there's a little more depth. When you restart at a checkpoint, you keep the amount of health you started that stage with. Normally I hate this, but you do have the ability to go back and replay previous parts of the level. If you do better and have more health at the checkpoint, that amount of health saves instead. This system takes the best of both worlds, by being forgiving with its checkpoints while also providing a challenge, and I like the agency it gives the player. If you're not okay with the amount of health you have, try again. As for the visuals, it's more of a personal thing, but I'm not the biggest fan of the visuals in the original Gunstar Heroes. The character and boss designs were great, but it was an early Genesis game, and Treasure's first game, so sometimes the background is a little too bright and not as distinctive as it could have been. Gunstar Superheroes has a more distinct menu design and aesthetic. I prefer its visuals and character designs too. Take a look at the silly dice maze for example. In the original, the visuals have this odd wavy blue background, and yeah, it looks fine, but it's a little abstract. Gunstar Superheroes sets it in an actual city, and there's a little more aesthetic flair. The gameplay is mostly the same as the original in principle, but it does some of its own things to set it apart. You can't mix and match weapons, for example. You have just 3 weapons you're able to cycle between. This brings to mind Alien Soldier, which had the same weapons as Gunstar Heroes, but you couldn't mix and match them. It doesn't really work the same way though, since the guns feel fairly similar. One isn't especially more effective against a boss, so there's not much of a reason to cycle between them frequently. I don't want to compare literally every part of this game to the original Gunstar Heroes, because it does its own thing in some regards, but I did prefer that game system with weapons. You're also given a melee attack in this game, which is something you didn't really have in Gunstar Heroes, since you could grapple opponents. Jumping at enemies and attacking them up close is a surprisingly large part of the Gunstar formula, so I like that it's changed here, and it does actually have a pretty distinct effect on how the game feels. Let's not lie to ourselves, Gunstar Heroes is a better game, but Superheroes is fun regardless. There's a bit more of an attempt at storytelling which I enjoyed too. You get more dialogue from bosses and characters, and Gunstar Yellow actually has a role to play. There's even some rudimentary voice acting from the bosses. The original Gunstar Heroes didn't have this much story, which somewhat justifies this game taking so much from it, and in this regard, it almost feels like the game they were trying to make in 1993. Treasure has a complicated history with legacy. They built their brand off some classic Konami games while distancing themselves and making new IPs. As they went on, the games they made became part of their legacy, influencing future games in a way that respects the original and lets them stand on their own without demanding comparison between their games. They make spiritual successors, not sequels, except for when they don't. That makes Gunstar Heroes such a strange game. Treasure hasn't done something like it before. It's stuck in the middle, between being a sequel and a remake in a way that makes it hard to justify its existence sometimes. It's a constant, ever-present reminder of Treasure's legacy, and you can't not compare it with Gunstar Heroes. It does things of its own for sure, but it's very close to a remake. Gunstar Superheroes is still a wonderful game, and it's the best type of remake, one that stands alongside the original and provides a unique experience within its framework, even if it doesn't match its quality exactly one-to-one. But that said, sometimes the question of did it need to exist isn't fully resolved in a satisfying way. You should not play this directly after Gunstar Heroes expecting an original experience. After playing these sequels, I do wonder what other games would make for good sequels if Treasure ever decided to make more games again. There's the obvious idea of a third Radiant Silvergun / Ikaruga game, but that's kind of different since those were successors and not just sequels. Still, I think there's enough fresh ideas they could bring to a new shoot 'em up. It's a shame Gradius V was their last one. I would love to see a sequel to Light Crusader. They haven't done a dungeon crawler since that game, and I'd love to see new ideas they could bring if they made a modern game like it. Light Crusader was entirely set in one dungeon, so if they include more locations or just expanded the scope, that would be a great legacy follow-up. There's also Bangai-O. That game was made up of lots of different shorter bite-sized levels, and there's lots you can do with that concept. In fact, the DS had already released by this point, and Treasure's next title would be not a sequel to Bangai-O. Maybe I could have timed that segment, never mind. Treasure are back to making anime fighting games. Bleach, the Blade of Fate. I have this game physically, but I got the Japanese version at a con because I forgot it wasn't a Japan exclusive. There's lots of menu text too, I can't really play the game. Oops. Bleach the Blade of Fate is a 2D fighting game based on the Soul Society arc of the shonen anime Bleach. We are back to the gameplay style and feel of Yu Yu Hakusho Makyo Toitsusen, complete with all that game's quirks. It's controlled fairly slowly, and there's more of a focus on battling multiple opponents at a time. To accommodate this, you don't automatically face your opponent if you walk away from them. It's been years since Makyo Toitsusen, and it's surprising that the gameplay format is still being preserved. I can only presume that this had Asuka 120% developers too. The real strength of the fighting gameplay is how combo heavy it can be. You have a light, medium, and heavy attack, and an air dash, making for a game where long combos are easy to pull off. A lot of people might be put off by the slow gameplay, but I don't mind fighting games that aren't set to turbo mode. Taking your time makes it easy to size up a situation and plan how to pull off combos. A fight is usually pretty long because of how slow it is, so there's only one round instead of two like most fighting games. You also have special and super moves, which can be activated by touching buttons on the bottom screen of the DS. I like that. Many casual players have difficulty getting used to the motions for pulling off special moves, especially when you have to use a D-pad. This makes it more approachable. There weren't many fighting games this casual friendly in 2006. You can also apply various debuffs or buffs to yourself or enemies using the touchscreen. It's nothing big, but sometimes fighting games stick to genre conventions so much that it's surprising when one includes something new. The last big important gameplay feature is the dodge button. It works similarly to the dodge feature in Dragon Ball FighterZ, allowing you to teleport behind the opponent in a very anime way. It works well with the fact that you're not always facing the opponent, and it kind of justifies that in a way. There's a huge roster of characters from Bleach to play as in the arcade mode. I haven't read Bleach in a while, and I completely forgot there were so many characters at this point in the story. Most characters are sword users, since it is Bleach after all, but they all play pretty differently and all have different abilities. As fun as the arcade mode is, the real meat of the game is the story mode. It adapts the story quite closely, with a lot of dialogue and a lot of fights. You play as Ichigo the whole time, and I do kind of wish I got to play as someone else, even if he is the one doing all the fighting in the series. Those buff and debuff abilities are themed around his allies at least, so it feels like they have a role to play. I always enjoy fighting game story modes because the fights feel like they tell their own stories that you're a part of. For example, if you take a huge beating by an enemy and then make a comeback with a big combo, that's a story you just created with your own gameplay, and you can imagine what these characters might be thinking or what they might say to each other. Sometimes you can fight multiple opponents at once, which encourages more thinking from the player as you pay attention to the physical space you're in. You can jump between layers of the background using an ability called the flash step, so that way you're not forced to fight both enemies at every moment. In Makyo Toitsusen, you can jump between the background and foreground in any fight, but here you can only do it in fights against multiple opponents. Streamlining it was definitely the right move. Unfortunately, the story mode kind of drags in places. There are conditions you have to meet in order to pass certain fights, like not using the flash step or not using any super combos. The game doesn't tell you this explicitly though. Characters will give you cryptic hints about what condition you have to beat is, and it's clearly meant to pad out the game's runtime, especially because you have to beat each opponent twice to progress. They only tell you the condition to beating them after you've won once. It doesn't make for a very well-paced story mode. Yu Yu Hakusho Makyo Toitsusen was an understated yet odd part of Treasure's history. Bleach the Blade of Fate shows us that it wasn't a one-off, and that they were completely capable of developing more than just one pretty solid anime fighting game. Bleach was a massive series in the mid-2000s. This was the first Bleach game on DS. There were many Bleach fighting games to come afterwards. This series has a huge history with fighting games that Treasure was a part of. It doesn't end yet either, because a year later, Treasure would release a sequel. Did you know that Treasure developed Dark Souls? I mean, this series was just called Bleach DS in Japan, so clearly From Software couldn't be aware of the blatant copyright infringement in calling their series Dark Souls. Here's Bleach Dark Souls, released in 2007. Bleach Dark Souls makes some welcome improvements on the Blade of Fate's format, but it's mostly more of the same. Treasure hasn't ever really made a more of the same type sequel before, but I'm not opposed to those types of sequels, especially for a fighting game where you can be more iterative. Treasure does make these kinds of licensed games primarily because of the financial aspect after all, and having more games on shelves means more monies in pockets. The gameplay is kept the same, although they do speed it up to make it flow more seamlessly than the Blade of Fate. Some characters have additional moves to give it more depth as well, and the gameplay is a slightly more refined version of that game. Bleach Dark Souls features 44 characters in total for its arcade mode, so it's kind of crazy how huge it is. This is definitely a crowd pleaser of a game with the amount of content it features. You also have a whole deck building system, which is how you decide what buffs and debuffs to give to your opponents. They are randomized though, so it doesn't give you too much agency. The story mode is much better in terms of the gameplay. You have a world map, so you don't have to guess where and how to progress. Instead of challenges, the battles are usually minigames where you're tasked with doing something like making the most jumps or collecting the most candy, alongside traditional fights. The jank is gone, making for a story mode that's just way better with its gameplay. I didn't find the story itself to be as strong though. Video game adaptations of manga usually don't capture the stories well, but the Blade of Fate managed to at least capture my attention with a strong hook surrounding rescuing Ichigo's friend Rukia. All the fights were in service of this goal, so you felt like you were making progress. In Dark Souls, Rukia is missing, so you have to find her, but 90% of your interactions are just mingling with characters without much purpose. The fact that this game isn't based on the arc after the Soul Society arc is a little weird, and it felt like they were hasty in making this tie-in game to the point there wasn't good material to pull from. That's about it in terms of Treasure's 2 Bleach games published by Sega for DS. Bleach Dark Souls is basically the Blade of Fate 1.5, and if it weren't for the content of its story, it would completely eclipse it in my mind. Thanks to Treasure, Bleach can now claim that it has better fighting games than Naruto and One Piece, but not Dragon Ball. Later on, 2 other games with the title Bleach DS would be released by Sega without Treasure's involvement, and they would completely change the genre as well. As I said, Bleach has a lot of video games. Treasure would make another Bleach fighting game and release it for the Wii, so we'll have to see how much they change the format for that. Before we do, however, Treasure has another sequel for a legacy series, Bangai-O Spirits, released in 2008. When I first played Bangai-O, I didn't really get it. It wasn't until I played the sequel that its format really stuck with me. This is one of Treasure's most high-octane, intense experiences, yet also a chill, laid-back game you can complete at your own pace. There is next to no story context for Bangai-O Spirits. You're a small robot up against a ton of other small robots and the many missiles they fire at you. Unlike the original, you have access to several types of weapons, which can be mixed and matched. You have homing missiles, missiles that bounce around, even melee weapons like a sword. Your mission is to not get too lost in the chaos while trying to fly and dash your way to the targets found in each stage. You can also knock enemies into each other for chain together combos, which seems to be a theme in some of Treasure's handheld games. The real star of the combat is the good old classic EX shot, that super powerful barrage of missiles where you can fire up to 100 at a time depending on how much you charge it, which you can use as a counter to enemy attacks. Technically, the amount of missiles you can fire is decreased from Bangai-O on Dreamcast and N64, but it's a DS game. What did you expect? It's easy to get overwhelmed in this game. It can take just a second for an entire life bar to get demolished by enemies, and doing anything will always be risky. So controlling the chaos is what that ability is for. Sometimes, Bangai-O Spirits doesn't even look like a game, it looks like a mandala. Bangai-O Spirits is also very self-aware. The game even pokes fun at the fact that not all the missiles will appear on screen all the time due to hardware limitations. There are some big lampshades in the game. Bangai-O had a bit of a plot, but here it's mostly been gutted. The only story in Bangai-O Spirits comes in a short tutorial segment. The game is basically just a list of selectable levels. There's 17 tutorial stages, teaching you the basics of the game, and the characters are constantly breaking the fourth wall or making nods to the player. The hardware of Bangai-O Spirits is a big part of its identity. It's a pick up and play title where you can start wherever you want and wherever you want, and there's no pressure to beat everything. This was perfect for the DS. I'd liken it to Angry Birds or something. It's a chill game to play to blow off some steam when you're bored. Like Angry Birds, it's not perfect. Some stages don't work the best, and sometimes the physics feels inconsistent. But if you're not clicking with it, skip a stage. When I think about Bangai-O this way, it helps me understand the gameplay style more. It's clear that Treasure has a winning formula on their hands. In the age we're in, where small titles can be big successes, Bangai-O has a ton of potential to come back and shine even more than before. Another thing that was a big selling point about Bangai-O Spirits is the level editor. You're able to create and share your own levels. That would have been really cool at the time, and I like seeing Treasure embrace hardware features wholeheartedly like this. There was even a competition held where employees from several big American developers, like Naughty Dog, created their own Bangai-O Spirits levels shortly after the game was released. Bangai-O Spirits is a testament to the idea that sometimes a sequel doesn't have to be bigger to be better. In fact, you can make a sequel smaller, make the levels shorter, and take away parts of a gameplay formula to allow the truly unique parts to shine. Okay, who's ready for some more Bleach now? .3D anime arena fighters have a reputation for being somewhat shallow. Fighting games on Wii have a reputation for... shallow would be putting it nicely. Treasure's next Bleach fighting game, Bleach vs. Crusade, manages to at least be a pretty fun game under those circumstances. The game was a Japan exclusive, so I won't be able to evaluate much besides the core gameplay, but it is a fighting game, so that works out pretty well anyways. There is an English patch, but that only translates the menu text, not the dialogue in the story mode. The combat is held in a full 3D space, where you can lock onto your enemy and do a few attacks. You can play with a GameCube controller or a classic controller, so you don't have to deal with the jankiness of playing a fighting game with a Wii Remote and nunchuck. Each character has projectile attacks and their own special ability activated by pressing the Y button. There's also an option to dodge around as well. It wouldn't be too inaccurate to call this a 3D version of the gameplay in Treasure's Bleach DS games, especially because you can have battles with multiple characters in the story mode, and summon out characters as assists in Versus mode. What really makes fights fun though, is the combo system. You automatically start comboing your opponent with a series of sword slashes or punches if you move the C stick, and it's shown in a really cinematic way. It basically looks like a whole cutscene as you hit them over and over again, and you can't tell by looking at the gameplay, but I'm literally just moving the C stick in a circle right now. The fighting in this game is really flashy and satisfying. It's not as deep as the Bleach DS fighting games, but it is still a well put together game. Arena fighters get something of a bad rep from competitive fighting game players, but there's a reason they're popular and lots of people enjoy them casually. They're fun and satisfying, which is their main priority. I enjoy the fast-paced action in Bleach vs. Crusade, and doing a 10-hit combo in any context isn't very likely to not feel fun. You can definitely get a sense that the game was meant to be controlled with a Wii Remote and nunchuck, but a classic controller doesn't feel awful as a control scheme, and I like the fact that you can play in a more traditional way if you want to, even if the C-stick as a method of attack is weird to get used to. I can't really make out what modes the game features besides Versus, but there is a story mode. There are lots of cutscenes and 50 chapters in total, so I assume it's also an adaptation of some manga material. I can't understand any of it, but I do appreciate how in-depth it is. I played through the whole story mode in one sitting, and I am glad I could skip the dialogue easily. Most of the battles have Ichigo fight the villains of this series, but it also features some sections where you play as his friends or soul captains, so there's a little more variety there. There's a handful of playable characters in the game, and they do feel meaningfully different to play as, something arena fighters don't always manage to do. Bleach vs. Crusade is another fairly solid game. I'd recommend it to fans of source material, and it manages to be above average in its field, even if it's simple and doesn't push the envelope very much. This was the last licensed game Treasure would ever develop. That's a little bittersweet in a way. Actually, we're fairly close to the end of Treasure's career in game development, but don't worry, there are still 2 other games I'm very excited to play and talk about. And 2 other games I feel neutral on. Here's a sequel I never would have expected to get made, Sin and Punishment Star Successor, released on Wii in 2009. The original Sin and Punishment was 9 years old by the time its sequel released, and Sin and Punishment Star Successor is a huge crowd pleaser for fans of the original game. This game feels exactly what it would have been like if the original Sin and Punishment kept going on, and I mean that in the best way possible, because sometimes that's all you could ever want in a sequel. But let's get this straight. This game exists pretty much primarily because of the Wii remote. Treasure saw the pointer functionality and decided that a Sin and Punishment sequel would be ideal for the Wii. The game was fully developed by them this time, unlike the original Sin and Punishment. There was so much creative energy around the Wii's launch, and you get the sense that Treasure's been wanting to make something like this for a long time. I actually played using the more traditional control scheme though. The game allows you to use a classic controller or a GameCube controller. This is a case similar to Bleach vs. Crusade, where I admire Treasure's desire to offer an innovative new control scheme while also offering a more grounded one with a normal-ass controller. It helps the game feel timeless. It makes it way easier to emulate too. It's an idea Nintendo themselves could have used for some of their first-party games. In addition to the GameCube controller, classic controller, and the Wii remote, you can also use the Wii Zapper accessory. I don't understand why you would want to, but it's neat to have the option. Getting into the gameplay, there are a few changes, but it mostly sticks to the formula of the original. It's a more of the same sequel, which is a good way of handling a game with an arcade style like this. You have 2 characters you play as throughout the game, Issa and Kachi, with Kachi locking onto enemies automatically, and Issa being the manual aim option. So basically, it's the same setup as Gunstar Heroes. You also have 2 new big additions to gameplay, the Charge Shot and a Jetpack. The Charge Shot can be used to fire huge explosions, but get this, it needs to recharge after you use it. The Jetpack allows you to freely move in the air, which adds a whole extra layer of gameplay. There will be sections where you move seamlessly from grounded combat to being in the air, and that allows for set pieces in design the original wasn't able to tap into. There's one section that's essentially a 2D side-scroller, and one that's a huge vertical shaft with a giant boss, for example. That's not even getting into how insane the theming is. One level has you underwater. That's so awesome. Sin and Punishment Star Successor's gameplay changes are slight, but deliberate, and it makes you realize just how much potential the original game's formula still has. The story is once again insane and hard to make sense of, but you're fighting a bunch of fish in a giant underwater tube, so that's all that really matters. The male protagonist, Issa, is the son of Saki and Iran, who appeared in the original game.
Could you not call me Mommy?
And the female protagonist has a connection to Sin and Punishment as well, which is kind of crazy when you find it out. Overall, there's not quite as much to say on Star Successor, because if you're familiar with the original, you'll get the gist of it. But that doesn't make it unmemorable, and I really hope Sin and Punishment can come back someday. Maybe the Switch 2 mouse feature could make for a good gimmick, I don't know. Sin and Punishment Star's successor almost equals the original in quality, and it joins the prestigious group of games Treasure has made that I consider must-plays. There's one more sequel based on existing IP to get to, Bangai-O HD Missile Fury. Xbox Live Arcade was a big deal for the Xbox 360. It was one of the first times nostalgia was a huge selling point, and many classic games got re-released for the very first time on the Xbox 360 this way. Treasure would port a few of their titles to Xbox Live Arcade, but Bangai-O HD is the only fully original title made for the service. I'm glad for that because Bangai-O has such a versatile formula, and a quick bite-sized downloadable title that provides you with more of it is a great sequel idea. It's probably better than a simple port of Bangai-O or Bangai-O Spirits. Bangai-O HD was released in 2011, which means this was the first time Treasure went at least a year without a new game since their inception. Since the game released on an HD home console instead of a handheld, Bangai-O HD is also able to ramp up the chaos and absurdity of the formula to an insane degree. In Bangai-O, the counterattack let you fire at most 400 missiles, but now you can fire up to 1,000 missiles. You will be shocked at how bold this game is in doing insane shit. This is the third level of the game. Once again, Bangai-O lights up a cigar, slams its fist on the table, and says, "Damn the frame rate. It does not care about running well." It's actually a very fast and fluid game, but it slows down when you fire 1,000 projectiles at a time, what a surprise. So it doesn't play fast and fluid most of the time. Admittedly, I was emulating the game since the game is currently delisted, so it's possible that the full release runs a bit better, but I wouldn't count on it considering this series is past. It is a shame that the game isn't available to purchase anywhere, because it's pretty fun. Bangai-O still feels like the perfect series for a modern revival. Out of the Bangai-O trilogy, I think HD might be the weakest, although the differences in quality are so small, they're hardly worth comparing in the first place, especially when they have pretty similar formulas. Bangai-O HD's massive levels and the sheer amount of chaos is even more overwhelming than the other games. Once again, I need to remind you, this is the third level. It also explains its mechanics even less, and there's only really one character instead of 3, like Bangai-O Spirits, so the story is even smaller. I could also see some people preferring the pixel looks of previous games over the 3D models in Bangai-O HD. Most Xbox Live Arcade games are made on the cheap, and have art styles that are generally agreed to not have aged well. I'm not going to say Bangai-O HD's art style holds up super well, but it's at least really satisfying to fire a shit ton of missiles and destroy everything on screen, so I can't complain for a smaller title. Next time Bangai-O should let you fire 10,000 missiles. If the frame rate is good, it isn't Bangai-O. 3 years have passed since the release of Bangai-O HD Missile Fury. We are at a point where Treasure is dwindling, and their output has been getting slimmer fast. They would release 2 more games in collaboration with a new beloved publisher, Capcom, Gaist Crusher and Gaist Crusher God. Both released for 3DS as Japan exclusives in 2013 and 2014 respectively. Gaist Crusher was intended to be a massive multimedia franchise, in the same vein as Pokemon or Digimon, and with a similar elementary school age target demographic. It had been years since those franchises first exploded and inspired a wave of copycats, but just by being developed by Treasure and coming out on the 3DS, Gaist Crusher had a chance to stand out by being the new attempt at a game like that on the 3DS that people would pay attention to. Before Yokai Watch took that title, even if it was never likely to come close to competing with those franchises. Along with 2 games developed by Treasure, Gaist Crusher received a manga and an anime done by Studio Pierrot. The series is set in the future, where humanity has become reliant on a metal called the Gai metal, and are attacked by creatures called Geists made out of Gai metal. Geist is spelled G-A-I-S-T, by the way. This has nothing to do with poltergeists, to my knowledge. The main characters are a squadron called the Gaist Crushers, who have to fight back the Geists. They're also a bunch of elementary schoolers, because of course they are. Now, I will be clear here that Gaist Crusher is more about the story, and most of it was devised by Capcom. Treasure's actual contributions only go so far as developing the games, and I'm not sure how important they were to the broader project of Gaist Crusher. Actually playing the games themselves, they're fine, as the gameplay is a simple beat 'em up without much to give it depth. Gaist Crusher God is also more of the same. It has the same storyline as Gaist Crusher, but with an additional extra storyline that's mostly more of the same. You have the ability to change characters, and each character has different forms that usually make their attacks heavier, while giving them comically large weapons. Simply working your way through small groups of enemies is most of the gameplay. I don't think the combat is bad or anything. I had fun with it, but it doesn't take much to impress me combat-wise. I just like beating dudes up and smashing robots sometimes. That is a service Gaist Crusher is willing to provide. There's the additional boss, which is basically just a powered-up enemy. Circling around them while swinging a big sword is probably the most fun parts of the game. Some of the bosses have pretty cool designs. They even had Akira Toriyama and Eiichiro Oda, the two biggest manga creators arguably, contribute Geist designs, which was a big deal I hardly see anyone talking about. The structure of Gaist Crusher has you take on a series of missions, and for most of them the dialogue are longer than the levels themselves, which should give an idea of how in-depth they are. This definitely feels like a game for Japanese 8-year-olds. I should emphasize, I can't really judge this franchise fairly. I don't know the full picture, so you shouldn't consider this a full review of the games. I can say above all else that the combat is passable, and for what Gaist Crusher is going for, it seems okay. Gaist Crusher is a very obscure franchise, especially in the West. I can't even find information about who at Treasure directed the games. I also haven't been able to find any information surrounding whether or not the series was a success, but since it never continued past 2014, I can summarize that Capcom decided it was not. The anime and manga series were both short-lived, and while the anime did receive an English dub, it was unceremoniously cancelled and only aired in parts of India and Southeast Asia. Only 8 episodes are preserved, leaving the rest as lost media. Since Capcom is notorious for leaving franchises on hold if they're not some of their bigger moneymakers, I doubt Gaist Crusher will be remembered. It is a complex way for Treasure to, in a sense, end. Treasure isn't actually technically completely dead. The company exists still, and Masato Maegawa, who founded it in the first place, is still around. Since 2014, they've ported a few games to modern hardware, but that's about all they've done. Since there were less than 10 staff at Treasure, I think it's fair to call them functionally dead. Most of their big staff have gone on to other companies, or have left the video game industry altogether. As far as we know, Maegawa might be the only one from the Konami days still at Treasure. I think it's pretty clear to see why I consider this a shame. Treasure is one of the most consistently quality video game companies to exist, and have cemented themselves as a cult classic machine. They have worked closely with big companies, but almost have an underground sort of spirit to them that reflects in their games. Treasure has influenced the industry in a way that's not obvious at first. You have to dig around a little bit to find their influence, but once you find it, it is really, really important. Treasure changed how people look at video games. They could continue to be really valuable if they made more games, especially because indie games are only getting more and more popular as time goes on. But I think dwelling on this does a disservice to their legacy. Treasure's old classics will always be there to look back on, and they will always be fun to play again. I know I've been a little annoying in telling you to play these games over and over again, but I think playing games is important, and I do really think some of Treasure's greatest titles are worthy for anyone to try. Even their more lesser known games have elements that make them valuable. These are gateway games. They can help you appreciate older games and the craft of video games in general. And look on the bright side. Now, Treasure's way of developing games isn't so rare anymore. We've already seen the generations of game developers that were inspired by Treasure, and games similar to what they've created are continuing to be released, as long as you look for them. I wouldn't despair about Treasure's so-called death so much. In 2022, Treasure celebrated its 30th anniversary. They took the opportunity to announce they were working on a highly requested title. Whoa! What the fuck? That's a huge deal. I didn't want to get my hopes up because that was 3 years ago, and the announcement was ambiguous enough that it could be anything. A part of me is still really excited this happened though, and I have some hope it won't turn out to be an empty promise. I've also played 33 Treasure games for this video. I'm kind of too tired to really care as of now. That was a lot. You know, they specifically said that highly requested title. They never said they were working on a highly requested title in a Treasure series. They're gonna develop Half-Life 3. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you later. But first, I made a list ranking every Treasure game from worst to best. I might as well share here. The only games I left out were Gaist Crusher and Gaist Crusher God, but I do have that cancelled Tiny Toons Adventure game. So just for fun, here's my ranking. From worst to best. Advanced Guardian Heroes. This is the only one I consider an actually bad game. Stretch Panic, Silhouette Mirage, Dragon Drive, D-Master Shot, and those last three are the only ones I consider like D tier, I guess, if we have to make a tier list about them. Tiny Toons Adventures, Buster's Bad Dream, Rakugaki Showtime, YuYu Hakusho, Makyo Toitsusen, Bleach vs. Crusade, McDonald's Treasureland Adventure, Tiny Toons Adventures, Defenders of the Universe, Bleach the Blade of Fate, Bleach Dark Souls. Again, these are games that are so similar, I consider Bleach Dark Souls to be slightly better, but they are kind of interchangeable. Wario World, Silpheed the Lost Planet, Gradius V, Bangai-O HD Missile Fury, Gunstar Heroes, Bangai-O, Bangai-O Spirits, Guardian Heroes, Ikaruga. And after Ikaruga, these next 10 are the ones I consider must-plays. I guess if you really like shooters, Ikaruga can be a must-play. It's kind of on the brink of it, I don't know. Hajime no Ippo the Fighting, Sin and Punishment Star Successor, Sin and Punishment. It is kind of, I think it might be a little controversial to say Sin and Punishment is better. I don't really know, but these are also games that are kind of interchangeable. I just think Sin and Punishment has the edge because it was the one that came up with the concept first, and I like some of the level design a bit better. Dynamite Headdy, Light Crusader, Mischief Makers, Astro Boy Omega Factor, and the top 3, Alien Soldier, Radiant Silvergun, and Gunstar Heroes. I can't believe Treasure peaked with their first game. How embarrassing. What a terrible video game company.